What if everything you thought you knew about reputation was just the tip of the iceberg? What if I told you that in the ancient world, your reputation wasn't merely about what people thought of you? It could mean the difference between life and death, between sitting on a throne and being thrown into a dungeon. Imagine living in an era where perception wasn't just social currency. It was the very foundation of power, the invisible force that shaped empires, toppled kings, and decided the fate of millions. This was the high-stakes, often brutal, always fascinating ancient game of reputation, a contest where narratives were weapons, public image was armor, and the stories told about you could either crown you a god or condemn you to oblivion. In this video, we're going to travel back through time to uncover how reputation functioned as the ultimate tool of influence in societies from Rome to Egypt, from Greece to Persia. We'll explore how legendary figures like Alexander the Great, Cleopatra, and Julius Caesar didn't just rely on armies or wealth to secure their power. They mastered the art of crafting their own myths, shaping how they were seen by their subjects, their allies, and their enemies. We'll delve into the strategies they used to build their legends, the subtle and not so subtle ways they maintained their stature, and the shocking speed with which a reputation could crumble under the weight of scandal, betrayal, or defeat. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a deep dive into the psychology of power, the mechanics of perception, and the timeless human drama of how we seek to control what others think of us. But why does any of this matter today? Because the ancient game of reputation never really ended. The same forces that elevated pharaohs to divine status or turned emperors into legends are still at play in our modern world, in politics, in business, in our daily lives. The strategies might have evolved, but the fundamental rules remain unchanged. By understanding how reputation was wielded, protected, and sometimes shattered thousands of years ago, we gain a powerful lens through which to view our own era. So join me on this journey through some of history's most dramatic reputational battles. Together, we'll uncover the secrets of this age-old game and discover how its echoes still shape the world we live in today. But what exactly was reputation in the ancient world? It was so much more than just what your neighbors thought of you. In societies from Egypt to Rome, reputation was a form of social currency, a tangible asset that could be earned, spent, and even stolen. It was the collective story a community told about an individual, a narrative woven from threads of fact, rumor, achievement, and often outright fabrication. This public image wasn't just about personal honor, it was a survival mechanism and a political tool of immense power. Your reputation determined your eligibility for public office, your ability to form powerful alliances through marriage, and even your basic safety within a volatile political landscape. A strong reputation could open doors to untold wealth and influence, while a damaged one could lead to exile or a knife in the dark. Leaders understood this intimately. They knew that controlling the narrative was just as important as controlling the army. A pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was a living god, his reputation carefully crafted through monumental architecture and religious ceremony to reinforce his divine right to rule. In Rome, a general like Julius Caesar didn't merely report his military victories. He wrote his own accounts, shaping the story of his brilliance and bravery for a public hungry for heroes. This construction of reputation was a deliberate and sophisticated process. It involved poets paid to compose epic verses, artists commissioned to create flattering sculptures, and coins minted with idealized portraits that circulated to the farthest corners of an empire. It was about creating a legend, a persona so powerful that it commanded loyalty and deterred challengers. Reputation was also incredibly fragile, constantly being assessed and reassessed by the public, the Senate, and rival factions. A single military defeat, a rumor of scandal, or a perceived insult to the gods could unravel years of careful image building in an instant. This vulnerability made the management of reputation a daily and high-stakes occupation for anyone in power. They had to project strength, wisdom, justice, and divine favor, all while vigilantly guarding against any threat to that carefully constructed facade. In essence, reputation was the invisible architecture of ancient power, the foundation upon which thrones were built and the fault line that could cause them to crumble. Understanding this concept is the first step to appreciating the incredible lengths to which historical figures went to win this eternal game. Now, if your entire claim to power rested on a carefully constructed story of divine favor, what would you do if that story was suddenly challenged? You might turn to the very source of divine authority itself, the oracles and prophecies that served as the ancient world's ultimate public relations firms. These were not just superstitious whispers in the dark, they were sophisticated institutions, powerful enough to crown emperors and spark revolutions with a single, cryptic phrase. Think of the most famous of them all, the oracle at Delphi in ancient Greece. Perched on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, this was the place where the god Apollo was believed to speak directly through a priestess, the Pythia. Kings, generals, and ordinary citizens would undertake long, arduous journeys to ask their most pressing questions, offering lavish gifts in hopes of receiving a favorable reply. The answers were famously ambiguous, a clever built-in feature that allowed them to be interpreted in multiple ways depending on the outcome. This ambiguity was the genius of the system. It provided divine cover for human ambition. A general asking if he should go to war might be told that a great empire would fall. He would assume it meant his enemies, but it could just as easily have been his own. This uncertainty gave the oracle's priests immense behind-the-scenes power, as they often helped interpret the riddles in ways that suited their political or financial interests. The influence of these pronouncements on a leader's reputation was immediate and profound. A positive prophecy could transform an obscure figure into a legend overnight. Take the young Alexander the Great. Before embarking on his monumental campaign to conquer the Persian Empire, he visited the Siwa oasis in Egypt to consult the oracle of Zeus Ammon. The priest there reportedly greeted him as the son of Zeus, a divine endorsement that instantly supercharged his reputation. It wasn't just a nice title, it gave him a spiritual legitimacy that resonated deeply with both the Greeks and the Egyptians, making him appear not merely as a foreign conqueror, but as a destined ruler ordained by the gods. This divine association became a core part of his brand, a reputational shield that helped him consolidate power across vastly different cultures. On the flip side, a negative or worrying prophecy could be absolutely devastating. The most famous example might be the warning given to Julius Caesar to beware the Ides of March. That prophecy from a seer named Spurina became a central part of the narrative of his assassination. Whether he heeded it or not, the story cemented in history the idea that his downfall was foretold, that it was an inevitable act of fate rather than just a political murder. This added a layer of tragic destiny to his story, but it also served as a potent warning to other leaders about the power of prophetic words to shape their legacy. But here's the crucial part: the most cunning rulers didn't just passively receive prophecies, they actively manipulated them. They understood that oracles were institutions, and institutions could be influenced, bribed, or even created. In Rome, the Sibylline books were a collection of prophetic utterances that were consulted only in times of extreme crisis by a special college of priests. Their contents were a closely guarded state secret, which gave the ruling elite tremendous power to discover prophecies that conveniently justified their political agendas. Need to declare an expensive war, the Sibylline books might suddenly contain a verse demanding it. Want to introduce a new god to the Roman pantheon to unite the people. The books could provide the perfect divine authorization. This was reputation management at the highest level, using the cloak of divinity to legitimize decisions and maintain public order. Even the locations of oracles were strategically important. By controlling the site, a ruler could control the narrative, ensuring that the divine will always seemed to align with their own ambitions. They would fund the temples, appoint friendly priests, and even spread stories of miracles associated with their reign, all to create an unshakable public perception that they were chosen by the gods. This blurring of myth and reality was not seen as deception. It was a fundamental tool of governance. A ruler's reputation for being divinely favored created stability, discouraged rebellion, and commanded loyalty in a way that mere force of arms never could. It was the ultimate shortcut to credibility, turning a mortal man into a living legend whose authority seemed to come from the heavens themselves. Yet for all its power to build a legend, military reputation was a terrifyingly fragile thing, balanced on a knife's edge between glory and ruin. A single defeat could unravel decades of carefully constructed invincibility in a matter of hours. Consider the Persian king Darius III. He inherited an empire of unimaginable wealth and power, his reputation as the great king seemingly unassailable. But his encounter with Alexander at the Battle of Issus changed everything. The story of his flight from the battlefield, abandoning his own family and his royal chariot, spread like wildfire. This wasn't just a military loss, it was a catastrophic failure of leadership that permanently stained his reputation. Coins and inscriptions that once proclaimed his divinity now seemed like hollow boasts. His aura of invincibility shattered. He struggled to command loyalty from his own satraps, and his empire began to crumble from within long before Alexander delivered the final blow. His story is a stark reminder that in the ancient world, a military reputation was not a permanent trophy but a volatile currency, constantly being evaluated and subject to instant devaluation. The same public that cheered a triumph one day could quickly turn to scorn after a defeat, seeing not a divinely favored leader, but a fallen mortal who had lost the favor of the gods. This vulnerability meant that for ancient rulers, the reputation game did not end when the battle was won. It required constant reinforcement, eternal vigilance, and an unending campaign to ensure that the story of their greatness was the only one that history would remember. But military victories, while powerful, were often distant events witnessed by only a few. How then could a ruler make his greatness tangible for the masses, for the common citizen who never set foot on a battlefield? The answer lay in the heart of the city, in the grand, thunderous, and bloody theater of public spectacles. These events were far more than mere entertainment. They were meticulously stage-managed acts of political theater, designed to dazzle, distract, and dominate public opinion. In Rome, the thunderous roar of the crowd in the Colosseum wasn't just noise, it was a barometer of imperial popularity. A successful games organizer or editor could win the hearts of the people more effectively than any speech in the Senate. The scale was everything. Emperor Trajan, to celebrate his conquest of Dacia, held games for 123 straight days, featuring 10,000 gladiators and the slaughter of 11,000 animals. This staggering display of wealth and logistical power sent an unmistakable message. The empire was so vast and its leader so generous that he could literally bring the world's wonders and horrors to the people's doorstep for their amusement. It was a direct transaction, bread and circuses in exchange for loyalty and political quiet. The spectacle was a distraction, yes, but also a powerful unifier. In that vast arena, social hierarchies were temporarily suspended. The emperor sat alongside the common man, both sharing in the same visceral experience, creating a fleeting but potent sense of shared community and imperial identity, all under the benevolent gaze of the ruler who provided it all. This strategy of spectacular generosity wasn't confined to Rome. Centuries earlier, in the city-states of Mesopotamia, rulers used religious festivals for the same ends. The Babylonian New Year festival, the Akitu, was a 12-day extravaganza that reaffirmed the king's divine mandate to rule. In a key ritual, the high priest would strip the king of his regalia, slap him across the face, and force him to kneel before the statue of the god Marduk to beg for forgiveness and reaffirm his humility. This might seem like a public humiliation, but it was brilliantly calculated theater. By willingly undergoing this ordeal, the king demonstrated that his power was not his own. It was granted by the gods and contingent upon his pious conduct. He was then reinstated amid even greater celebration, his authority freshly sanctified, and his connection to the divine visibly reaffirmed for all his subjects to see. It was a masterclass in reputation management, transforming a potential display of weakness into a powerful ritual of legitimacy. These festivals, with their processions, feasts, and public rituals, served the same purpose as the Roman games: to bind the people to their leader through a shared, emotionally charged experience that reinforced the social and political order. Perhaps no one understood the propaganda power of public works and games better than Rome's first emperor, Augustus. After the bloody chaos of the civil wars that ended the Republic, his most urgent task was to rehabilitate his image from that of a ruthless warlord to a benevolent father of the nation. He famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. This was not an idle boast about architecture, it was a statement of moral and political renewal. By building new aqueducts, temples, and grand public spaces like the Forum of Augustus, he was physically embodying his promise of peace, stability, and prosperity. He didn't just build infrastructure, he built a new narrative for himself and for Rome. His reign was packaged as a golden age, and every new building, every restored temple, was a permanent physical reminder of that claim. He also hosted magnificent games, but with a key difference. Where previous generals had used games to celebrate their own personal glory, Augustus framed his spectacles as gifts to the Roman people from their caring emperor, further cementing his role as the restorer of Roman tradition and civic virtue. He even published a list of his grandest spectacles, including gladiatorial contests and mock naval battles, ensuring that the scale of his generosity would be remembered for generations. This wasn't just spending, it was strategic investment in the most valuable currency of all, public perception. Through sight, sound, and stone, Augustus used spectacle to craft a reputation so solid that it successfully eclipsed the violent origins of his power and laid the foundation for centuries of imperial rule. But stone and spectacle were only part of the equation. The true genius of ancient reputation management was its ability to circulate, to embed its message into the very fabric of daily life. Imagine holding in your hand not just a piece of currency, but a tiny, portable monument to a leader's greatness. This was the power of coinage, one of the most pervasive and ingenious propaganda tools ever invented. Unlike a pyramid that stood in one place or a spectacle that lasted only a day, coins traveled. They passed from the hands of soldiers and merchants into markets, across borders, and through generations, carrying a carefully crafted image far beyond the reach of any single edict or speech. Every transaction became a silent, subtle reinforcement of a ruler's authority. A Roman denarius, for example, was more than just silver, it was a miniature billboard. On one side, the emperor's profile, often crowned with laurel to signify victory and honor. On the reverse, powerful symbols, a goddess representing peace, a ship signifying prosperous trade, or children gathered around, highlighting the emperor's role as a father to the people. These were not random designs, they were deliberate messages communicating stability, military success, and divine favor with every purchase. When Emperor Augustus issued coins celebrating his victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, he wasn't just funding his government, he was ensuring that the story of his triumph, his version of events, was the one that spread to every corner of the empire, from the bustling forums of Rome to the remotest frontier outpost. For many citizens, this image on a coin was the only likeness of their ruler they would ever see, making it an incredibly potent tool for shaping a universal and controlled perception. The language of these metallic messages was universal, but its dialects varied across empires, each culture emphasizing different aspects of their leader's reputation. In Persia, kings like Darius the Great issued coins known as darics, which depicted the monarch as a heroic archer or a powerful warrior, bow in hand, poised and ready. This image screamed military prowess and personal strength, a direct and intimidating message about the power backing the currency. Conversely, Greek city-states often used their coinage to showcase cultural and religious sophistication. An Athenian tetradrachm was instantly recognizable by the owl of Athena, the city's patron goddess, and an olive sprig, symbols of wisdom, wealth, and peace. This projected an image of a civilized, blessed, and prosperous polis, enhancing the reputation of its leaders as stewards of a superior culture. The choice of imagery was a strategic decision. A ruler facing internal dissent might issue coins highlighting concord or harmony. One needing to pay a large army might mint coins celebrating victory and martial virtue to keep the troops motivated. It was a real-time, responsive form of mass communication, allowing a leader to address crises, celebrate achievements, and reinforce their desired narrative on a scale that was unimaginable with any other medium. The coin was a promise, a threat, and a prayer, all stamped into a piece of precious metal. Yet the reach of coinage also made it vulnerable, and a monetary misstep could trigger a reputational disaster. When the Roman Empire began to face economic troubles in the 3rd century, emperors resorted to debasing the silver currency, mixing in cheaper metals to stretch their treasuries. The immediate effect was inflation, but the long-term damage was to imperial credibility. The people holding these increasingly worthless coins, still stamped with the emperor's confident, godlike face, felt a deep sense of betrayal. The disconnect between the promise of stability on the coin and the reality of economic collapse in the market was stark. It made the emperor seem weak, desperate, and dishonest, eroding the very trust that the coinage was designed to build. This demonstrates the double-edged nature of using currency as propaganda. While it offered unparalleled reach for building a reputation, it also directly tied that reputation to tangible economic performance. A strong, valuable coin reinforced a narrative of a strong, valuable leader. A weak, debased coin did the opposite, becoming a daily reminder of failure that citizens literally could not afford to ignore. It was a constant, physical audit of a ruler's management, proving that in the ancient game of reputation, even your pocket change could be a vote of confidence or a devastating indictment. But stone and spectacle were only part of the equation. The true genius of ancient reputation management was its ability to circulate, to embed its message into the very fabric of daily life. Imagine holding in your hand not just a piece of currency, but a tiny, portable monument to a leader's greatness. This was the power of coinage, one of the most pervasive and ingenious propaganda tools ever invented. Unlike a pyramid that stood in one place or a spectacle that lasted only a day, coins traveled. They passed from the hands of soldiers and merchants into markets, across borders, and through generations, carrying a carefully crafted image far beyond the reach of any single edict or speech. Every transaction became a silent, subtle reinforcement of a ruler's authority. A Roman denarius, for example, was more than just silver, it was a miniature billboard. On one side, the emperor's profile, often crowned with laurel to signify victory and honor. On the reverse, powerful symbols, a goddess representing peace, a ship signifying prosperous trade, or children gathered around, highlighting the emperor's role as a father to the people. These were not random designs, they were deliberate messages communicating stability, military success, and divine favor with every purchase. When Emperor Augustus issued coins celebrating his victory over Mark Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium, he wasn't just funding his government, he was ensuring that the story of his triumph, his version of events, was the one that spread to every corner of the empire, from the bustling forums of Rome to the remotest frontier outpost. For many citizens, this image on a coin was the only likeness of their ruler they would ever see, making it an incredibly potent tool for shaping a universal and controlled perception. The language of these metallic messages was universal, but its dialects varied across empires, each culture emphasizing different aspects of their leader's reputation. In Persia, kings like Darius the Great issued coins known as darics, which depicted the monarch as a heroic archer or a powerful warrior, bow in hand, poised and ready. This image screamed military prowess and personal strength, a direct and intimidating message about the power backing the currency. Conversely, Greek city-states often used their coinage to showcase cultural and religious sophistication. An Athenian tetradrachm was instantly recognizable by the owl of Athena, the city's patron goddess, and an olive sprig, symbols of wisdom, wealth, and peace. This projected an image of a civilized, blessed, and prosperous polis, enhancing the reputation of its leaders as stewards of a superior culture. The choice of imagery was a strategic decision. A ruler facing internal dissent might issue coins highlighting concord or harmony. One needing to pay a large army might mint coins celebrating victory and martial virtue to keep the troops motivated. It was a real-time, responsive form of mass communication, allowing a leader to address crises, celebrate achievements, and reinforce their desired narrative on a scale that was unimaginable with any other medium. The coin was a promise, a threat, and a prayer, all stamped into a piece of precious metal. Yet the reach of coinage also made it vulnerable, and a monetary misstep could trigger a reputational disaster. When the Roman Empire began to face economic troubles in the 3rd century, emperors resorted to debasing the silver currency, mixing in cheaper metals to stretch their treasuries. The immediate effect was inflation, but the long-term damage was to imperial credibility. The people holding these increasingly worthless coins, still stamped with the emperor's confident, godlike face, felt a deep sense of betrayal. The disconnect between the promise of stability on the coin and the reality of economic collapse in the market was stark. It made the emperor seem weak, desperate, and dishonest, eroding the very trust that the coinage was designed to build. This demonstrates the double-edged nature of using currency as propaganda. While it offered unparalleled reach for building a reputation, it also directly tied that reputation to tangible economic performance. A strong, valuable coin reinforced a narrative of a strong, valuable leader. A weak, debased coin did the opposite, becoming a daily reminder of failure that citizens literally could not afford to ignore. It was a constant physical audit of a ruler's management, proving that in the ancient game of reputation, even your pocket change could be a vote of confidence or a devastating indictment. While coins spread a ruler's image far and wide, there was another medium designed for permanence, carved not to circulate but to stand for eternity, declaring truths in stone that were meant to become unquestionable history. This was the power of the inscription, the official decree, the monumental text. Imagine a world before mass media, where a proclamation carved into a cliff face or etched onto a towering obelisk was the closest thing to an immutable public record. These weren't casual notes, they were declarations frozen in time, the ancient equivalent of pressing save on a version of events that the ruler desperately wanted to be the final draft. The material itself was a message. Choosing durable stone or precious metal signaled that the words were not fleeting. They were foundational, meant to outlast generations and weather the elements, just as the ruler's legacy was intended to do. A papyrus scroll could burn or rot, but a granite stele, that was forever. This permanence lent the words an aura of absolute truth. To challenge the narrative on the stone was to challenge something that felt as solid and real as the ground beneath your feet. It was psychological warfare waged across centuries, a direct conversation between the ruler and the future. Perhaps no inscription better illustrates this blend of boastfulness and calculated political justification than the Behistun Inscription. High on a cliff face along a major trade route in modern-day Iran, the Persian king Darius I had his story carved in 3 different languages, accompanied by a magnificent relief showing him triumphing over his rebellious rivals. The location was no accident. This was a busy highway of the ancient world, ensuring that travelers, merchants, and officials would all see this colossal billboard. The text is a masterpiece of reputation management, a detailed justification for what was essentially a coup. Darius had seized the throne after a period of turmoil, and he needed to legitimize his rule urgently. So he didn't just state his claim, he framed his ascent as a divine mandate, a righteous crusade against 9 lying usurpers who had challenged the natural order. He repeatedly credits the supreme god Ahura Mazda for his victory, writing, "By the grace of Ahura Mazda I am king." This wasn't just piety, it was a strategic move to place his authority beyond human reproach. He methodically lists the defeated rebels and their punishments, creating a chilling public record of his power to crush opposition. The Behistun Inscription is a permanent press release from a new CEO asserting control, warning potential challengers, and assuring the populace that stability had returned under a strong, divinely approved leader. It was history written by the victor, in the most literal sense possible, set in stone for all to see. This desire to control the historical narrative reached its peak in Rome with Augustus and his Res Gesti Divi Augusti, or the deeds of the divine Augustus. This document is arguably one of the most brilliant pieces of political propaganda ever composed. Unlike the Behistun Inscription, which was on a remote cliff, Augustus ensured his resume was posted in front of his mausoleum in Rome and copied onto temples across the empire. It's a first-person account of his life and achievements, but every word is meticulously chosen to craft a specific image. He doesn't mention his ruthless rise to power during the bloody proscriptions or his defeat of fellow Romans like Mark Antony. Instead, he focuses on what he gave back to the state, the vast sums of money he spent on the people, the public buildings he erected, the gladiatorial games he funded, and the peace he finally brought after decades of civil war. He lists the honors the Senate gladly bestowed upon him, framing his accumulation of ultimate power not as a seizure, but as a grateful republic bestowing responsibilities on its most benevolent citizen. He presents himself not as an autocrat, but as a humble servant who spent his entire life and fortune for the good of Rome. The res gesti is a lesson in reputation by omission. By carefully curating the facts and presenting them in a seemingly straightforward list, Augustus created a self-portrait of modesty, generosity, and piety that successfully whitewashed a far more complex and violent reality. It was so effective that it became the blueprint for how Roman emperors after him would want to be remembered. The influence of these decrees on public opinion was profound because they often served as the primary source of information. In an age without newspapers or instant communication, an inscription on a temple wall was the official news feed. When a citizen in a provincial town saw a new edict from the emperor proclaiming a great military victory or the completion of a new aqueduct, they had little reason to doubt its veracity. The very act of erecting it in a public space, often with great ceremony, bestowed upon it an air of unquestionable authority. These texts didn't just inform, they shaped reality. A decree praising the emperor's generosity after a famine could help quell unrest, redirecting anger towards local officials or bad weather rather than the distant ruler. A law code inscribed for all to see, like the famous Code of Hammurabi, projected an image of a just and orderly society, even if the reality of its application was far more uneven. The public reading of these decrees was also a key ritual, transforming written words into a shared auditory experience that reinforced community bonds and collective submission to the ruler's will. In this way, inscriptions were more than just records. They were active instruments of governance, tools to manufacture consent, foster loyalty, and build a reputation on a foundation that was literally set in concrete, designed to make a chosen version of the truth the only one that would ever matter. Yet a leader's reputation was not confined within the walls of their own cities or the borders of their homeland. It traveled across mountains and seas, carried by diplomats, merchants, and spies, becoming a crucial currency on the international stage. In the interconnected ancient world, a king's standing was not just a domestic concern but a geopolitical asset, carefully cultivated through complex networks of allies and a constant, delicate dance of diplomacy. A ruler's word, once given, became the foundation of their credibility abroad. A reputation for keeping promises made other leaders more willing to form alliances, while a reputation for strength deterred potential aggressors. This was a game played with envoys and treaties, wedding vows and hostage exchanges, all designed to project an image of power, reliability, and trustworthiness far beyond one's immediate reach. A powerful kingdom isolated by poor diplomacy was often a vulnerable kingdom, while a smaller state with shrewd alliances could punch far above its weight. The ability to navigate this intricate web defined empires and doomed dynasties, proving that a sharp tongue and a trustworthy hand could be as decisive as a sharp sword. This art of diplomatic reputation building is stunningly ancient. Consider Hammurabi, the famed king of Babylon, who ruled nearly 4,000 years ago. We know him best for his law code, but he was also a master strategist of alliances. In the early years of his reign, Babylon was just one of several competing city-states in Mesopotamia. Hammurabi couldn't simply conquer them all outright. He needed to be clever. He carefully forged a series of alliances with his more powerful neighbors, presenting himself as a reliable and loyal partner. He would offer military support to one king against a common enemy, all the while subtly positioning himself to benefit from the conflict. His reputation for military competence and initially for keeping his word allowed him to build a powerful coalition. But the true masterstroke was in the timing of his betrayals. Once his allies were weakened from their own wars and his own power had grown sufficiently, Hammurabi would turn on them, conquering his former partners one by one. While this ultimately worked, it came at a cost to his long-term reputation. His actions cemented his legacy as a brilliant but ruthless expansionist, a warning to future leaders that while strategic betrayal could bring short-term gains, it could also permanently brand one as untrustworthy, making future alliances far more difficult to secure. Centuries later, Philip II of Macedon perfected a different approach, using diplomacy not as a prelude to betrayal but as a multiplier of his own growing power. He inherited a weak, backward kingdom on the fringes of the Greek world and transformed it into the dominant power in Greece, largely through a combination of military innovation and utterly shrewd diplomacy. Philip understood that his reputation was his most valuable export. He used gold not just for his army, but to create a network of influence across Greece, bribing politicians and funding friendly factions in other city-states. He married strategically no fewer than 7 times, each union sealing an alliance with a powerful family or a neighboring kingdom. But his most powerful tool was his ability to identify and exploit divisions among his rivals. When Greek city-states were mired in their endless squabbles, Philip would position himself as a mediator, a strong, neutral party who could bring order to the chaos. He would offer protection, make promises, and present himself as a reasonable man, all while his army grew stronger. His reputation became one of inevitable progress. By the time Athens and Thebes finally realized the true threat he posed and united against him, it was too late. His diplomatic efforts had already isolated them, ensured the neutrality of others, and built a coalition that allowed him to crush them at the Battle of Chaeronea. Philip didn't just conquer Greece, he outmaneuvered it diplomatically, proving that a reputation for strategic intelligence could conquer lands before a single soldier ever marched. However, the flip side of this high-stakes game was the devastating cost of a broken promise. In a world where international law was fragile and based almost entirely on personal honor, a ruler's credibility was their bond. A single act of perfidy could echo for generations, making future partners impossible to find. The ancient historians are filled with tales of treaties shattered and the consequences that followed. When a powerful king failed to send the military aid he had pledged, his name became synonymous with unreliability. When an ally was betrayed during a negotiation, the insult would be remembered for decades, poisoning relations and often leading to vengeful wars. This was because diplomacy was intensely personal. Agreements were made between rulers, not between abstract states. The trust was placed in the individual, in their character, their honor, and their fear of divine retribution for oath breakers. A damaged diplomatic reputation was therefore incredibly difficult to repair. It signaled to the world that your word was worthless, that your treaties were traps, and that alliance with you was a liability. In such a climate, even a militarily powerful state could find itself isolated, surrounded by enemies it had created through its own duplicity, learning the hard way that in the long run, a reputation for trust was the most valuable garrison a leader could possess. But controlling the narrative wasn't just about etching words in stone or stamping them on coins. It required the masters of language itself, the poets and historians who could weave facts and fiction into a tapestry so compelling it could define a leader for millennia. These storytellers were the ultimate reputation engineers, the ancient world's equivalent of elite public relations firms and biographers rolled into one. A king might win a battle, but it was the poet who decided whether that victory was remembered as a brutal slaughter or a glorious, divinely ordained triumph. A historian's pen could carefully omit a disastrous famine or amplify a minor act of generosity into a legend of boundless benevolence. Their power lay in their ability to shape not just what people thought, but how they felt about their rulers, transforming raw events into resonant stories that cemented a legacy in the cultural consciousness. This wasn't seen as dishonest in the modern sense. It was an understood part of the patronage system. A ruler provided wealth, protection, and status, and in return, the intellectual crafted a version of reality that bolstered the ruler's authority and justified their power. It was a symbiotic relationship where art and politics became inseparable, and the battle for reputation was fought with metaphors and elegies. Perhaps the most famous and successful example of this partnership was the relationship between the Roman Emperor Augustus and the poet Virgil. In the wake of a devastating century of civil wars that had shattered the Roman Republic, Augustus's most pressing challenge was to legitimize his new, unchallenged power and present it not as a dictatorship but as a glorious and inevitable restoration. He needed a story, a national myth that would unite the people behind him. Enter Virgil and his epic masterpiece, the Aeneid. On the surface, it's the thrilling tale of the Trojan hero Aeneas's journey to Italy to found a new nation. But just beneath that surface, it is a brilliant piece of political propaganda commissioned by Augustus. The entire poem is a carefully constructed argument for the destiny and divine right of Augustus's family, the Julian clan. Aeneas is portrayed as the son of the goddess Venus, making his descendants, including Augustus, literally divine. Aeneas's character is the ideal Roman leader, pious, dedicated to his duty to the state above his personal desires, and destined to bring order and civilization. This was the exact image Augustus wanted for himself. Most famously, in the underworld, Aeneas is shown a prophecy of Rome's future heroes, culminating in Augustus, who is hailed as the bringer of a new golden age. By anchoring his rule in this epic, mythological past, Augustus didn't just become a political leader, he became the fulfillment of a cosmic prophecy, a destined savior. Virgil's beautiful poetry made this message palatable, even inspirational, weaving Augustan propaganda into the very fabric of Roman identity for centuries to come. Yet for every poet hired to burnish a reputation, there was a historian whose critical eye could inflict lasting damage. The Roman historian Tacitus stands as the prime example of a writer whose work became a permanent indictment of the imperial system he lived under. Writing about the Julio-Claudian emperors who preceded him, Tacitus adopted a tone of cynical, disillusioned analysis. He didn't celebrate their conquests. He dissected their moral corruption, their paranoia, and the suffocating atmosphere of a Senate reduced to sycophancy. His accounts of Tiberius's reclusive depravity on the island of Capri, or Nero's artistic vanity and brutal persecution of Christians, were not dry recitations of facts. They were moral judgments painting a picture of a political system that corrupted absolutely. Because his writing was so sharp, so psychologically insightful, and so compelling, it stuck. His portrayal of these emperors became the dominant one that passed into history. When we think of Nero today, we largely see him through the lens Tacitus crafted, a monster of ego and cruelty. This was the terrifying power these historians wielded. They knew that while emperors controlled the present, they themselves were writing for posterity. A critical historian could ensure that a ruler's sins were never forgotten, that their reputation would be tried in the court of history and found forever wanting. This battle over narrative wasn't confined to Rome. Centuries earlier, the Greek historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, walked a fine line between reporting and storytelling. While he gathered accounts from his travels, he also included myths, rumors, and dramatic dialogues that made for a great story but blurred the lines of factual accuracy. His depiction of the Persian kings, while fascinating, often served to contrast Eastern tyranny with Greek freedom. a narrative that flattered his Greek audience and shaped Western perceptions of the Persian Empire for ages. Conversely, his successor Thucydides aimed for a much more rigorous, factual approach in his history of the Peloponnesian War, explicitly criticizing those who preferred romantic tales to sober truth. Yet even Thucydides made choices about which facts to include and how to frame them, crafting a tragic narrative about the moral decay of Athens under the strain of a prolonged war. His reputation for severity and accuracy itself became a powerful tool, lending his version of events an authority that less critical accounts lacked. This demonstrates the spectrum of influence these writers held, from the epic poet who built legends to the skeptical historian who deconstructed them, all playing their part in the eternal game of deciding how the powerful would be remembered. Yet for all the power of poets to build legends and historians to shape lasting judgments, the most dramatic moments in the ancient reputation game often came from its sudden, catastrophic failures. A lifetime spent crafting an image of divine favor, military invincibility, or paternal benevolence could be undone in an instant by a single scandal, a whispered rumor that caught fire, or an act of such breathtaking hubris that it shattered the public's trust forever. This vulnerability was the dark shadow side of reputation management, a constant reminder that the higher a leader built their legend, the farther they had to fall. In societies where power was personal and legitimacy rested on perception, a scandal wasn't just embarrassing, it was an existential threat. Accusations of tyranny, corruption, or sexual immorality didn't simply damage a ruler's social standing, they could unravel the very fabric of their authority, convincing soldiers to mutiny, senators to conspire, and citizens to riot. The mechanisms that built reputation, gossip, public spectacle, religious piety, could be turned against a ruler with devastating speed, revealing just how fragile this constructed reality truly was. Perhaps no ancient figure embodies this spectacular reputational collapse more than the Roman Emperor Nero. For the first years of his reign, his image was carefully managed by his advisors, presenting him as a generous and accessible young leader, the heir to Augustus's legacy. He sponsored lavish games, distributed gifts to the people, and even promoted a cultural renaissance. But this carefully constructed facade began to crack under the weight of his increasingly erratic and narcissistic behavior. A pivotal event was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. While the city burned for 6 days, Nero was famously accused of fiddling, though the instrument would more likely have been a lyre. The story, whether true or masterful propaganda by his enemies, was catastrophic. It painted him as not merely indifferent to his people's suffering, but as actively enjoying their devastation. His response, to blame the city's small Christian community and have them brutally executed in horrific public spectacles, only deepened the public's horror and fear. Then came the scandals of his personal life, his divorce and execution of his wife Octavia, a popular member of the imperial family, and his public relationship with Poppaea Sabina, which violated every Roman norm of marital propriety. But the final straw was his obsession with performing as a musician and charioteer on public stages. For the Roman elite, this was not a charming hobby, it was a profound humiliation. The emperor's role was to preside over games, not to compete in them alongside slaves and social outcasts. This degradation of the imperial office, combined with his extravagant spending on a vast new palace, the Domus Aurea, or Golden House, while the city still recovered from the fire, completed his transformation in the public eye from a leader into a self-absorbed monster. His reputation shattered, he faced revolts across the empire and was ultimately declared a public enemy by the Senate, leading to his suicide. Nero's downfall is a masterclass in how a series of scandals, both public and private, can coalesce into a narrative of tyranny that destroys even the most powerful ruler. Across the Mediterranean, the reputation of Queen Cleopatra VII of Egypt faced a different but equally potent kind of smear campaign, one orchestrated by the most powerful propaganda machine of the ancient world, Rome. To her own people, Cleopatra was a capable and intelligent ruler. She was the first of the Greek Ptolemaic dynasty to actually learn the Egyptian language. She revitalized the economy, and she presented herself as the reincarnation of the goddess Isis, a powerful symbol of divine legitimacy. But in Rome, her reputation was systematically destroyed by her enemy, Octavian, the future emperor Augustus. In the brutal civil war against Mark Antony, Octavian realized he could not attack Antony, a celebrated Roman general, directly. So he attacked through Cleopatra. He weaponized Roman prejudices against powerful women and Eastern, Oriental decadence to craft a terrifying narrative. He portrayed Cleopatra not as a strategic political partner to Antony, but as a sinister seductress, a sorceress who had used magic and sexual witchcraft to enslave a noble Roman's mind and will. He circulated rumors of her unbelievable luxury and decadence, claiming she dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar just to win a dinner party bet. His propaganda framed the war not as a Roman political struggle, but as a defensive crusade against a foreign queen who threatened to enslave Rome itself and move its capital to Alexandria. This was a brilliant, cynical strategy. It allowed Octavian to paint his rival Antony as an un-Roman traitor under the thumb of a monstrous woman, thus transforming a complex power struggle into a simple, patriotic war for survival. After his victory at Actium, Octavian had this version of events etched into history through his coinage, monuments, and the poetry he sponsored. Cleopatra's subsequent suicide only cemented his narrative, allowing him to claim she had been overcome with fear and madness at the prospect of being paraded in his triumph. For centuries, the Roman image of Cleopatra as a licentious, power-hungry temptress overshadowed her reality as a shrewd and resilient leader, proving that a reputation could be assassinated long after the person was gone. Faced with such threats, ancient leaders weren't passive victims. They employed sophisticated and often desperate forms of damage control. One common tactic was the strategic sacrifice of a subordinate. When public anger over a policy or scandal became too intense, a ruler might offer up a trusted advisor as a scapegoat, publicly punishing them to appease the mob and protect their own position. This cynical practice acknowledged the need for a public display of accountability while preserving the core of the ruler's power. Another method was to double down on the very strategies used to build reputation in the first place. A leader accused of impiety might fund an extravagant new temple or very publicly consult an oracle. One accused of greed might host the most lavish games ever seen, buying back public affection with bread and circuses. They might also go on the offensive against their accusers, using the same tools of gossip and propaganda to destroy their enemies' reputations first, characterizing them as liars, traitors, or fools. In the most extreme cases, a ruler might resort to sheer terror, using arrests, executions, or purges to silence criticism outright. This was a high-risk strategy, however, as it often confirmed the very accusations of tyranny it sought to suppress. These ancient attempts at reputation repair highlight a constant tension. The same public that could be swayed by grand gestures and new narratives could also become cynical, their trust, once broken, becoming almost impossible to fully restore. A scandal created a crack in the foundation of a ruler's legitimacy, and no amount of gold or propaganda could ever completely erase the memory of what that crack revealed. For women in the ancient world, the reputation game was played on a vastly different and far more dangerous board, where the rules were written by men and the penalties for a misstep could be utterly devastating. While a man's reputation might be built on military conquests or political eloquence, a woman's was almost always tethered to the private sphere, to her chastity, her fidelity, and her role as a dutiful wife and mother. This created a paradox of immense consequence. A woman was expected to be influential, to advise her husband and raise powerful sons, but she was never supposed to be seen seeking power for herself. Any overt step into the public arena risked being instantly reinterpreted through a lens of suspicion and scandal. She could be praised as a virtuous matron, a model of Roman pudicitia or Greek sophrosine, but the same actions that earned that praise, managing the household, advising her husband, could, if she became too effective, be twisted into accusations of manipulation, scheming, and dangerous ambition. Her reputation was not her own. It was a reflection of the men around her, a commodity to be protected, traded, and often weaponized by the male narratives that sought to control her story. This precarious balancing act makes the achievements of figures like Hatshepsut of Egypt all the more extraordinary. In the 15th century BC, she didn't just advise a pharaoh, she became one. As the chief wife of her half-brother Thutmose II and then regent for her young nephew Thutmose III, she initially wielded power from behind the throne. But within a few years, she took the unprecedented step of declaring herself full pharaoh, co-ruler of Egypt. To cement this audacious claim, she had to masterfully manage her reputation on multiple fronts. She adopted the full royal titulary and was depicted in official art and statuary with the traditional male regalia of a pharaoh: the kilt, the false beard, the muscular physique presenting an image of unquestionable masculine authority. Simultaneously, she launched a brilliant propaganda campaign centered on her divine birth, claiming the god Amun-Ra himself had fathered her, thus placing her right to rule beyond earthly challenge. She commissioned magnificent monuments, most notably her breathtaking mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahri, which served as both a testament to her power and a permanent, stone-bound argument for her legitimacy. For over 2 decades, she ruled a prosperous and stable Egypt, one of its most successful monarchs. Yet, after her death, her name and image were systematically chiseled from monuments and her statues torn down in an attempt to erase her from history, a stark reminder that even the most successfully crafted female reputation could be vulnerable to the patriarchal backlash of subsequent generations. Centuries later, and in a very different culture, the women of the Julio-Claudian dynasty in Rome, like Agrippina the Younger, navigated this treacherous landscape with ruthless political savvy. As the sister of one emperor, Caligula, the wife of another, Claudius, and the mother of a third, Nero, Agrippina understood that her power was entirely relational. She couldn't command legions or address the Senate, so she mastered the art of influence. Her reputation was a carefully managed tool. She presented herself as the ideal Roman matron, but one with unparalleled proximity to power. She is famously depicted on a period coin facing her husband Claudius, an equality in imagery almost unheard of for an imperial wife. She reportedly advised Claudius on state matters and secured the succession for her son Nero, even allegedly poisoning Claudius to ensure it. Ancient historians like Tacitus and Suetonius, men deeply suspicious of female power, painted her as the ultimate schemer, a poisoner and a seductress who stopped at nothing. This negative portrayal, written by her enemies, largely defines her historical reputation. But from another angle, Agrippina was simply playing the only game available to her with consummate skill, using her intelligence and her relationships to protect her own position and that of her son in a lethally volatile court. Her eventual murder on the orders of Nero, the very son she worked to install, is a tragic testament to the ultimate fragility of a woman's power when it threatened a man's authority. The story of these women and countless others underscores the brutal double standard at the heart of ancient reputation. A man's ambition was praised as virtus, his strength and courage. A woman's similar ambition was almost invariably condemned as a monstrous perversion of her natural role, labeled as ambitio or libido, unrestrained and dangerous desire. A male ruler with multiple sexual partners was exercising his privilege. A woman accused of the same was irredeemably scandalous, her personal morality becoming a proxy for her political untrustworthiness. This is why the Roman propaganda against Cleopatra was so effective. Octavian couldn't attack Mark Antony's military record directly, so he attacked through Cleopatra, framing her not as a strategic equal but as a decadent Eastern seductress who had enslaved a noble Roman's will. Her intelligence became witchcraft, her political acumen became manipulation, and her diplomatic prowess became treachery. Her reputation was systematically dismantled not because of her failures, but because of her formidable strengths, which posed a threat to the Roman patriarchal order. Yet despite these overwhelming constraints, some women found ways to carve out a measure of control over their own narratives. Through patronage of the arts, funding of temples and public buildings, and the strategic use of their wealth, they could craft a public image of piety and generosity. Some, like the skilled orator and philosopher Hypatia of Alexandria, built a reputation solely on intellect and wisdom, though even that could not save her from a brutal death at the hands of a mob. The stories of these women are not just footnotes to history, they are powerful reminders that the ancient game of reputation was gendered to its core. To understand how reputation worked, we must listen for these quieter, more complex stories, the ones that show us not only how power was won, but who was allowed to compete for it in the first place, and the extraordinary lengths they had to go to get a seat at the table. If military might built a throne and public spectacles filled its court, then religion provided the sacred canopy that sheltered it all, transforming a mere ruler into something far greater, a figure touched by the divine. This was the ultimate reputational upgrade, a strategy that placed a leader's authority beyond human challenge by anchoring it in the will of the gods. Across the ancient world, from the sun-baked banks of the Nile to the 7 hills of Rome, the most successful rulers understood that to command absolute loyalty, they needed to be seen not just as powerful administrators, but as chosen instruments of celestial power. This divine association was the most potent currency in the reputation economy because it made obedience a religious duty and dissent a sacrilegious act. A king could be overthrown, but a god-king, that was a far more daunting prospect for any potential rebel. Nowhere was this fusion of ruler and deity more absolute than in ancient Egypt. The pharaoh was not merely a king, he was considered a living god, the earthly incarnation of the god Horus, and the vital link between the people and the pantheon. This wasn't a vague spiritual idea, it was the foundational principle of the entire Egyptian state. The pharaoh's role was to maintain Mat, the cosmic order of truth, justice, and harmony. His every action, from winning a battle to presiding over a harvest festival, was a ritual that kept chaos at bay. This divine reputation was reinforced through breathtaking architecture. The colossal temples at Karnak and Luxor were not just places of worship, they were massive stone propaganda machines. Their towering pylons and inscribed walls depicted the pharaoh in intimate conversation with the gods, receiving their power and their blessing. By funding these projects, the pharaoh was visibly investing in his own divine narrative, creating a physical landscape that screamed his godhood to every citizen. This reputation was so effective that it created a remarkably stable political system that endured for nearly 3,000 years. Challenging the pharaoh wasn't just treason, it was a threat to the very balance of the universe. The Romans, ever the practical imperialists, took a slightly different but equally calculated approach to divine reputation. While early Roman emperors were cautious about claiming outright divinity while alive, it would have offended the staunchly republican sensibilities of the Senate. They enthusiastically embraced it after death. Through a formal process called consecratio, a deceased emperor who was deemed worthy by the Senate could be declared divus or a god. This was a masterstroke of political and reputational engineering. It allowed the current emperor to rule as a mortal, albeit one with immense power, while still benefiting from the reflected glory of a divine father or predecessor. The Emperor Augustus was particularly brilliant at this. He heavily promoted the cult of his adopted father, Julius Caesar, who had been deified after his assassination. By calling himself Divi Filius, the son of the divine, Augustus wrapped himself in a cloak of sanctified legitimacy. He became the son of a god, ruling with a mandate from heaven. This posthumous deification also served as a powerful incentive for good behavior. An emperor knew that his eternal reputation, whether he would be remembered as a god or a monster, rested in the hands of the Senate and his successor. It was a clever system that used the promise of divine honors to encourage at least a semblance of responsible rule. Perhaps no ancient leader better illustrates the sheer power of a well-timed divine endorsement than Alexander the Great. His legendary visit to the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis was a reputational masterclass. After conquering Egypt, Alexander made a perilous journey across the desert to this remote shrine, one of the most revered oracles in the ancient world. The priest there, either through genuine belief, careful coaching, or political savvy, reportedly greeted Alexander not as a mortal man, but as the son of the god Zeus Ammon. This was a transformative moment. For his Greek soldiers, it connected him to Zeus, king of their own gods. For his new Egyptian subjects, it linked him to Ammon, their own powerful deity. This single proclamation provided a universal, cross-cultural justification for his rule. It explained his incredible, seemingly impossible string of victories not as mere military luck, but as the inevitable result of his divine parentage. From that moment on, Alexander's reputation was forever altered. He began to adopt the trappings of a Persian god-king, and his image on coins increasingly reflected this new, semi-divine status. The Siwa incident shows that a divine reputation didn't always require a lifelong claim. Sometimes, one perfectly staged moment at a holy site could be enough to launch a legend that would echo for centuries, providing an unassailable answer to the question of why one man should rule over so many. Yet for all the power of divine association and military spectacle, the most immediate test of a ruler's reputation often came not from the battlefield or the temple, but from the marketplace and the grain dole. A hungry populace rarely cares about glorious battle honors or grand new temples. Their loyalty is measured in full stomachs and economic security. In the ancient world, a leader's economic policies were perhaps the most direct and visceral factor shaping public perception. Prosperity created a halo effect, burnishing a ruler's image as a wise and benevolent provider, while economic hardship, whether from famine, inflation, or corruption, could swiftly erode decades of accumulated goodwill, exposing the fragile human beneath the divine facade. Managing an empire's treasury was also about managing its collective mood, making economic policy a powerful, if often overlooked, tool of reputational engineering. The Roman Emperor Trajan understood this connection better than most. His reign is often remembered for massive military conquests, but his domestic policies were arguably just as crucial to his stellar reputation. He implemented a monumental program of public works known as the alimenta, a sophisticated system of state-funded loans to Italian farmers. The interest from these loans was then used to support and feed orphaned and poor children throughout the peninsula. This was more than just charity. It was a brilliant economic and reputational strategy. It boosted agricultural production by providing capital to farmers, created a future generation of loyal citizens, and most importantly, projected an image of Trajan as the ultimate pater patriae, the father of the country, who cared for his subjects from childhood onward. He complemented this with massive building projects, roads, bridges, harbors, and his famous forum, which not only employed vast numbers of people but also improved trade and infrastructure, creating a tangible sense of progress and prosperity that directly benefited the common citizen. The Senate officially bestowed upon him the title Optimus Princeps, the best ruler, a testament to a reputation built as much on economic stability and social welfare as on military glory. Centuries earlier, in the Hellenistic world, the Ptolemaic dynasty of Egypt turned economic management into a fine art, and their control over the most essential commodity of all, grain, became the bedrock of their power and reputation. The Nile's predictable floods made Egypt the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, and the Ptolemies established a state monopoly on grain production. This wasn't simple greed, it was a calculated tool of statecraft. By controlling the supply, they could stabilize prices, prevent famine, and amass a tremendous royal treasury, but they also used this power strategically. In times of shortage elsewhere, they could open their granaries to allies, earning immense diplomatic goodwill. For their own citizens in Alexandria, they ensured a reliable and subsidized bread supply, which helped maintain order in an often volatile and cosmopolitan city. The famous Library of Alexandria and the towering lighthouse, one of the seven wonders, were not just cultural symbols, they were also powerful advertisements for the wealth and stability of Ptolemaic rule. They demonstrated that the dynasty's economic policies could fund wonders that attracted scholars and merchants from across the known world, creating a reputation for Egypt as a center of not just abundance, but also enlightenment and sophistication under its Greek rulers. However, the flip side of this equation was brutally simple. Economic failure led to a rapid and often violent collapse in public trust. The most stark example comes from the Roman Empire of the 3rd century, a period marked by severe monetary crisis. Facing constant warfare and pressure on its borders, emperors began desperately debasing the silver currency, the denarius. What was once nearly pure silver became a bronze coin with only the thinnest silver wash. The immediate result was runaway inflation. Prices for basic goods skyrocketed, soldiers demanded their pay in kind rather than worthless coin, and the savings of the middle class were wiped out virtually overnight. This economic chaos had a devastating effect on imperial reputation. The emperor's face was still stamped on every coin, but the message it now sent was one of weakness, desperation, and fraud. The state's most basic promise to provide a stable medium of exchange had been broken. This loss of faith was not just financial, it was political. It fed into a cycle of instability known as the crisis of the 3rd century, where emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, often assassinated by their own troops who had lost all confidence in the central government's ability to provide for them. The debased coinage was a physical, everyday reminder of a broken contract between ruler and ruled, proving that no amount of military victory or divine pretension could save a leader who failed the economic well-being of his people. This intricate dance between treasury and trust reveals a fundamental truth of ancient power. A reputation for economic competence was a slow-built but vital form of capital. It required a careful balance, funding grand projects to showcase greatness without bankrupting the state, ensuring the food supply to keep the populace content, and maintaining a stable currency to facilitate trade and savings. Leaders who mastered this, like Trajan or the early Ptolemies, were remembered as Golden Age benefactors. Those who failed, like the 3rd century Roman emperors, found that the loyalty of their subjects and soldiers was the first thing to depreciate when the money did. In the end, the most enduring monuments to a ruler's reputation were not always carved in stone. Sometimes they were measured in full granaries, sound coins, and the quiet, daily security of the people they were sworn to protect. Yet beyond the pragmatic concerns of grain and coinage lay a more refined, though no less strategic, arena of reputation building, the deliberate cultivation of the mind. For an ancient ruler, patronizing philosophers, poets, and scientists was far more than a personal hobby. It was a powerful declaration of values, projecting an image of wisdom, sophistication, and enlightened leadership that could elevate a state's prestige to dazzling new heights. This investment in intellect signaled that a leader's ambition extended beyond mere territorial conquest, aiming instead for a more enduring form of glory, the kind etched not on battlefields, but in the pages of history books and the halls of great institutions. It transformed a powerful monarch into a benevolent patron of civilization itself, attracting the brightest minds of the age to their court and creating a cultural magnetism that money or military might alone could never achieve. In 5th century BC Athens, the statesman Pericles perfected this strategy, turning his city into the undisputed intellectual and artistic capital of the Greek world. Following the devastating Persian Wars, Athens found itself at the head of a powerful naval alliance with a treasury brimming with tribute. Pericles made the audacious and controversial decision to use these funds not just for defense, but for an unprecedented building program aimed at glorifying the city itself. The crowning achievement was the Parthenon, a temple on the Acropolis so perfectly proportioned it seemed to have been descended from the gods. But this was more than architecture, it was a statement. By commissioning the sculptor Phidias and the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, Pericles was making Athens a living museum of human achievement. He also supported the great dramatists of the age, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, whose plays, performed at public festivals, explored complex questions of justice, destiny, and morality, turning theater into a civic dialogue that strengthened Athenian democracy. This cultural flourishing, now known as the Golden Age of Athens, was directly tied to Pericles' patronage. It created a reputation for Athens as a beacon of freedom, beauty, and intellectual daring, a legacy that has outlasted its empire by 2,000 years and continues to define our ideal of classical civilization. Centuries later, the Roman Emperor Hadrian pursued a similar path, but on a truly imperial scale. Known as the Greekling for his profound love of Hellenic culture, Hadrian was a restless intellectual, architect, and poet who used his power to become the ancient world's greatest tourist and patron. He didn't just fund the arts, he personally immersed himself in them, designing buildings, writing poetry, and engaging in philosophical debates. His most famous architectural legacy, the Pantheon in Rome, with its revolutionary domed ceiling and oculus open to the heavens, stands as a permanent testament to his sophisticated taste and engineering ambition. But his patronage extended far beyond the capital. He traveled relentlessly across his vast empire, not to wage war, but to build libraries, temples, and entire cities. In Athens, he completed the massive temple of Olympian Zeus, a project begun centuries earlier, symbolically finishing what the Greeks could not and positioning himself as the inheritor and custodian of their legacy. He also established the Panhellenion, a league of Greek cities that promoted cultural unity under his benevolent oversight. Hadrian's reputation became that of a civilized and philosophical emperor, a man of peace and learning who ruled through cultural affinity rather than brute force. This image of the wise, traveling emperor not only stabilized his reign but also created a powerful counter-narrative to the more brutal examples of Roman rule, proving that intellectual patronage could be a formidable tool of soft power and imperial cohesion. Yet no ancient institution symbolizes the ultimate ambition of intellectual patronage more than the legendary Library of Alexandria. Founded by the first Ptolemaic rulers of Egypt in the 3rd century BC, the library was much more than a repository for scrolls. It was the ancient world's greatest research university and a stunningly audacious propaganda project. The Ptolemies had a problem. They were Macedonian Greeks ruling a vast, ancient, and sophisticated Egyptian populace. Their legitimacy was always somewhat tenuous. Their solution was to make their capital, Alexandria, the intellectual center of the entire universe, thereby asserting their cultural superiority and drawing the world's genius to their doorstep. They did not do things by halves. Agents were sent to every port and market with orders to confiscate every book on every ship, copy it, and then, notoriously, often keep the original for the library's collection, returning the copy to the frustrated owner. They amassed an estimated 500,000 scrolls, aiming for a complete collection of all human knowledge. They didn't just collect knowledge, they generated it. The library attracted and funded a staggering array of thinkers: Euclid, who formulated his elements of geometry there; Archimedes, who visited and studied; Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with astonishing accuracy; and Aristarchus, who proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system millennia before Copernicus. The library was the ultimate status symbol. It proclaimed that the Ptolemaic kings were not just wealthy warlords, they were the guardians of human civilization. It brought unparalleled prestige to their dynasty, making Alexandria the place every scholar, doctor, and poet aspired to visit. It also had immense practical benefits. The advances in science, medicine, and engineering that emerged from the library directly benefited the state, improving everything from naval architecture to medical care. The museum, or House of the Muses, that surrounded the library was a state-funded research institute where the greatest minds of the age were offered free room, board, and a generous salary to simply think, debate, and discover. This was reputation management on a cosmic scale. By positioning themselves as the ultimate patrons of knowledge, the Ptolemies crafted a legacy of enlightenment that brilliantly overshadowed the often ruthless and fratricidal politics of their actual court, creating a narrative of greatness that still captures our imagination today. But a name alone was not enough to guarantee a smooth transition. It was the weight of expectation and the shadow of comparison that truly defined the experience of the heir. Stepping into the role of a legendary predecessor was like taking the stage after a masterful performance, with the audience's memory still fresh and their standards impossibly high. The new ruler immediately faced a dual challenge: to prove they were a worthy vessel for the dynasty's glorious legacy, while simultaneously establishing their own unique authority. This often led to a delicate dance of emulation and innovation. Some heirs would consciously mimic the public style of their famous parent, adopting their slogans, continuing their building projects, and even copying their mannerisms in an attempt to project a sense of continuity and stability. They would issue coins that highlighted their familial connection, reminding the populace that the bloodline, and thus the divine favor or inherent virtue believed to flow through it, remained unbroken. This strategy aimed to transfer the accumulated goodwill of the previous reign directly onto the new one, offering a shortcut to legitimacy that an outsider could never hope to achieve. The first months of a new reign were therefore a critical period of reputational banking, where the heir could draw upon the vast reserves of public trust built by their predecessor, using that capital to consolidate their own power before inevitably having to make their own deposits or withdrawals through their actions. This inheritance, however, was a double-edged sword, and no dynasty illustrates its perils more vividly than Rome's first imperial family, the Julio-Claudians. The founder, Augustus, spent a lifetime crafting a reputation as the restorer of peace, the benevolent father of the nation, and the man who transformed Rome from brick to marble. This was a monumental legacy, a towering benchmark for those who followed. His stepson and successor, Tiberius, struggled under this weight from the very beginning. He was a capable general and administrator, but he lacked Augustus's effortless public charm and political cunning. The Roman people and the Senate constantly measured him against the idealized memory of his predecessor, and Tiberius, a naturally dour and private man, was found wanting. His attempts to emulate Augustus's policies often came across as hollow or forced, and his increasing reclusiveness at his villa on Capri was interpreted not as a desire for privacy, but as a dark and tyrannical withdrawal from his public duties. The shadow of Augustus was so long that it obscured Tiberius's own competencies, twisting them into sins and ensuring his historical reputation would be one of gloomy suspicion, forever defined by his failure to live up to the golden standard set before him. The dynamic shifted dramatically with the ascension of his grandnephew Caligula. Here was a young man who seemed to be the antithesis of the grim Tiberius, youthful, vibrant, and, most importantly, the direct biological descendant of the beloved Augustus through his mother, Agrippina. The Roman populace, weary of Tiberius's isolation, projected all their hopes onto this young prince, whose childhood nickname, Little Boots, evoked a time of innocence and military camaraderie. Initially, Caligula played this part to perfection. He publicly mourned Tiberius with great ceremony, then swiftly reversed many of his unpopular policies. He recalled exiles, put on lavish games, and spent money freely from the treasury, presenting himself as a return to the generous, open-handed style of Augustus. For the first few months, his strategy of embracing his Augustan heritage worked brilliantly. He was wildly popular, and the dynasty's reputational capital seemed to be not just restored but multiplied. He was not just an heir, he was a savior, the true spiritual successor they had been waiting for. But then, something went catastrophically wrong. The pressure of the legacy, combined with what ancient sources describe as a severe illness that may have affected his mind, proved too much. The same hereditary reputation that had buoyed him up now became a cage. Perhaps feeling he could never truly equal Augustus by following in his footsteps, Caligula embarked on a path of shocking and deliberate contradiction. Where Augustus had cultivated an image of modest piety, Caligula engaged in outrageous sacrilege, reportedly planning to make his horse a consul and demanding to be worshipped as a living god. Where Augustus promoted traditional family values, Caligula's reign was marked by scandal and alleged incest. He exhausted the treasury that Tiberius had frugally maintained, not on public works but on personal extravagance. In a few short years, he systematically burned through every ounce of the dynastic reputation he had inherited. His actions were so extreme that they were seen not merely as personal failings, but as a betrayal of the entire Augustan legacy. He didn't just fail to live up to the family name, he actively desecrated it, forcing the Senate and the Praetorian Guard to intervene. His assassination was followed by a frantic effort to restore stability, a clear signal that the inherited reputation of the Julio-Claudians, while powerful, was not indestructible. It could be spent, and when it was, the fall was swift and brutal. Yet the story of hereditary reputation is not solely one of failure and pressure. Some of the most successful rulers in history were those who learned to harness their ancestry not as a burden, but as a narrative tool, a pre-written prologue to their own story that they could skillfully edit and expand upon. The Emperor Trajan, for instance, was adopted by the elderly and childless Emperor Nerva. He had no direct bloodline to the legendary founders of the empire, but he brilliantly leveraged the concept of adoptive succession itself. He presented his rule as a meritocratic choice, the selection of the best man to lead, which in itself became a powerful reputational asset, distancing him from the failures of biological heirs like Caligula or Nero. He could then build his own magnificent reputation as Optimus Princeps without being constantly compared to a biological father. Conversely, centuries later in Byzantium, the Emperor Constantine VII, known as Porphyrogenitos or Born in the Purple, faced a different challenge. He was a scholarly man who came to power after a period of regency and coups. His hereditary claim was impeccable, but his personal power was weak. His genius was to lean into his ancestry not as a military leader, but as the guardian of his dynasty's intellectual and cultural legacy. He devoted his reign to writing elaborate treatises on court ceremony, administration, and the history of his family, effectively codifying the mystique and authority of the imperial office itself. By doing so, he used the written word to cement his family's reputation for legitimacy and sophistication, ensuring that future generations would see the dynasty not through the lens of political intrigue, but through the cultured, permanent image he so carefully crafted. He understood that the most durable inheritance was not just a famous name, but the authority to define what that name would mean for all time. Yet for all the grand spectacles and towering monuments designed to project an image of unshakable power, every ancient ruler knew that their authority rested on a foundation that could be shattered in an instant by the one force they could never fully control: the will of their own people. A rebellion was more than just a military challenge. It was the ultimate audit of a leader's reputation, a brutal plebiscite where perceived weakness, injustice, or failure could ignite a firestorm of defiance that threatened to consume the throne itself. These uprisings were the moments when the carefully crafted narratives of divine right and invincibility collided with the harsh realities of hunger, oppression, and broken promises. How a ruler responded with overwhelming force, cunning diplomacy, or a combination of both became a defining chapter in their story, a public test that could either cement their legend as a strong leader or expose them as a vulnerable fraud whose time was running out. Consider the seismic shock that was Spartacus's revolt. In 73 BC, what began as a simple breakout of 78 gladiators from a training school in Capua exploded into a full-scale war that terrorized the heart of Rome for 2 years. The rebellion, led by the brilliant Thracian gladiator Spartacus, swelled to an army of over 100,000 escaped slaves and disenfranchised poor, who humiliated one Roman army after another. The reputational damage to the Roman state was catastrophic. This wasn't a foreign invasion, it was an internal explosion, a stark revelation that the very engine of the Roman economy, slavery, was a powder keg waiting to ignite. It exposed the fragility of the social order and the incompetence of the early military response. The Senate's initial attempts to crush the rebellion with hastily assembled militias ended in humiliating defeat, making Rome's ruling class look weak and disorganized. The crisis became so severe that the Senate finally turned to Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of the wealthiest men in Rome, granting him special command with the full resources of the state. Crassus understood that defeating Spartacus was not just a military objective but a necessary act of reputational repair. He restored brutal discipline to his legions, even reviving the ancient punishment of decimation, killing every 10th man in a disgraced unit, to signal his absolute seriousness. His ultimate victory was as much about messaging as it was about tactics. The crucifixion of 6,000 captured rebels along the Appian Way, their bodies lining the road from Capua to Rome, was a ghastly piece of political theater. It was a visceral, horrifying advertisement of the price of defiance, designed to sear into the public consciousness the absolute power of Rome and the futility of challenging it. For Crassus, it was a personal reputational triumph, proving he could deliver where others had failed. For the Roman state, it was a desperate and brutal reassertion of control, a stark reminder that a reputation for strength sometimes had to be rebuilt with unimaginable cruelty. On the other side of the Mediterranean, the Maccabean Revolt against the Seleucid Empire offers a masterclass in how a rebellion can be fueled not by economic despair, but by cultural and religious oppression, and how a ruling power's missteps can permanently destroy its legitimacy. The Seleucid king, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, was a Hellenistic ruler who saw cultural unity as the key to stabilizing his vast multicultural empire. His policy was to actively promote Greek culture, language, and religion. But in Judea, this project took a violently coercive turn. Antiochus outlawed key Jewish practices, such as circumcision and Sabbath observance, and most infamously, desecrated the temple in Jerusalem by erecting an altar to Zeus and sacrificing pigs within its sacred precincts. This was more than a political error, it was a profound reputational catastrophe. By attacking the very core of his Jewish subjects' identity, Antiochus didn't just make himself unpopular, he made himself illegitimate in their eyes. He was no longer a distant king to be obeyed, but a blasphemous tyrant to be resisted at all costs. The revolt that followed, led by Judas Maccabeus and his brothers, was therefore not just a fight for political freedom, but a holy war. The success of the Maccabees, who eventually rededicated the temple, an event commemorated by the holiday of Hanukkah, was a stunning defeat for Seleucid power. But more importantly, it was a permanent stain on the reputation of Antiochus. His name became synonymous with impiety and tyranny in Jewish tradition, a cautionary tale for any ruler who underestimated the power of faith and cultural identity. His attempt to impose unity through force backfired spectacularly, proving that a reputation for respecting the customs of subject peoples was not a sign of weakness, but a critical component of sustainable rule. The aftermath of a rebellion was just as critical as its suppression for a ruler's long-term reputation. A truly skilled leader understood that restoring order required more than just putting bodies on crosses. It demanded a concerted propaganda campaign to reshape the narrative of the conflict. The first step was often to dehumanize the rebels. They were never portrayed as justified freedom fighters or victims of injustice. In official pronouncements, they were labeled as bandits, pirates, madmen, or beasts, threats to the very concept of civilization itself. This rhetorical strategy served to justify the extreme violence used against them and to dissuade others from joining their cause. The next step was to claim divine favor for the victory. A ruler would dedicate a portion of the spoils to a temple, issue coins celebrating a victory over the barbarians, or commission a triumphal arch depicting their merciful subjugation of the troublemakers. The goal was to frame the conflict not as a near disaster that exposed systemic flaws, but as a preordained triumph that reaffirmed the ruler's divine mandate and personal virtue. The final and most cunning step was to address, or appear to address, the root causes of the discontent. A wise emperor, after crushing a revolt sparked by grain shortages, might make a very public show of reforming the grain dole or commissioning new aqueducts. He wouldn't admit the rebellion was justified, but his actions would signal that he was an attentive and benevolent father to his people, thus healing the wounds that had allowed the rebellion to fester in the first place. This three-pronged approach, brutal force, narrative control, and strategic reform, was the ancient playbook for turning a reputational crisis into an opportunity for renewal, proving that the most resilient rulers were those who could not only win a war, but also win back the story. Yet for all the sophisticated tools of diplomacy and cultural patronage, there existed a far more brutal and direct path to compliance, one that required no grand temples or clever alliances, only the unflinching willingness to wield terror as a weapon. This was the dark art of fear-based reputation management, a strategy that traded the slow work of building loyalty for the immediate, chilling effect of absolute dread. In the hands of certain ancient rulers, reputation was not about being loved or even respected. It was about being so terrifyingly unpredictable and ruthless that the very thought of defiance was extinguished before it could even form. These leaders understood that while love might inspire loyalty, fear could guarantee obedience through the most primal of human instincts, self-preservation. The Assyrian Empire of the early 1st millennium BC stands as perhaps the most stark example of this philosophy in action. From their heartland in what is now northern Iraq, the Assyrian kings built an empire through a calculated campaign of psychological warfare that was as effective as it was horrifying. Their reputation preceded their armies, carefully cultivated through a relentless stream of propaganda carved into stone monuments and palace walls. These bas-reliefs did not celebrate bountiful harvests or wise rule. They depicted in graphic, unflinching detail the consequences of rebellion. Viewers would see images of prisoners being skinned alive, impaled on giant stakes, or having their tongues torn out. The Assyrian king was always shown as a giant, godlike figure, effortlessly dominating his pathetic, groveling enemies. This was not merely art, it was a strategic message. When Assyrian envoys visited a potentially rebellious city-state, they would describe these scenes, making it clear that surrender was the only option that did not end in unimaginable agony. The goal was to break the enemy's will before the first arrow was ever fired, to make the cost of resistance so vividly terrifying that submission seemed the only rational choice. This reputation for calculated brutality allowed a relatively small nation to control a vast empire for centuries, as local governors and client kings lived in constant fear of inviting the Assyrian war machine's wrath upon their people. The Romans, though often celebrated for their law and engineering, were no strangers to this tactic, particularly during the volatile transition from republic to empire. The proscriptions of the late Republic were a chilling example of terror used for political and financial gain. A proscription was essentially a published hit list. Having your name posted on this list meant that you were an enemy of the state. Your property was confiscated, and anyone who killed you was not only immune from prosecution but rewarded with a portion of your estate. The second triumvirate of Octavian, Mark Antony, and Lepidus used this tool with devastating efficiency to eliminate their political opponents and fund their war chest simultaneously. The streets of Rome became hunting grounds, with men killed over petty grudges or simple greed, their heads displayed on spikes in the forum as a warning to others. This practice created an atmosphere of paranoia where no one, not even a wealthy and powerful senator, felt safe. The message was clear: cross the new regime, and you would not only die, but your family would be destitute and your legacy would be erased. It was a brutally effective way to cement power in the short term, but it also created a deep well of bitterness and resentment that would simmer for generations, demonstrating the inherent instability of a social contract written in blood. This approach to power, however, came with a catastrophic long-term cost. A ruler who relies on fear is like a man sitting on a powder keg. The silence he enjoys is not peace, but the quiet before the explosion. The obedience it breeds is brittle and conditional, lasting only as long as the threat remains immediate and credible. The moment a leader shows the slightest sign of weakness, an illness, a military setback, a financial crisis, the suppressed resentment can erupt into outright hatred and violent rebellion. The very cruelty that cowed a population into submission also eliminates any possibility of genuine loyalty or goodwill. There is no reservoir of public affection to draw upon in difficult times, no belief in the ruler's inherent goodness that might inspire people to endure hardship on their behalf. The Assyrian Empire, for all its terrifying power, was constantly plagued by rebellions the instant its attention was turned elsewhere, requiring endless, draining campaigns of reconquest. Its eventual collapse was so total and so violently celebrated by its subjects that its great cities were razed to the ground and forgotten for centuries. Similarly, the Roman proscriptions under the Triumvirate created a ruling class that was compliant on the surface but seething with hatred underneath, a dynamic that would contribute to the paranoia and violence that characterized the later Julio-Claudian emperors. A reputation built on fear is a fortress with no foundations. It may intimidate for a season, but it cannot withstand the first real tremor of discontent, leaving behind a legacy remembered only for its cruelty, not its achievements. However, ruling an empire of such staggering diversity presented a monumental reputational challenge. How could a single leader possibly be seen as legitimate and worthy of loyalty by people who spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, and lived by entirely different codes of honor? The answer for the most successful conquerors was not to force everyone to become like them, but to skillfully present themselves as already being one of them. This was the high-wire act of cultural assimilation, a delicate dance where a ruler's willingness to adopt the customs of the conquered could become their most powerful tool for building a lasting and stable reputation. It required a profound understanding that true power isn't just about commanding obedience. It's about crafting an image that resonates deeply across every corner of a vast and varied realm. Alexander the Great provides the most breathtaking example of this strategy in action. After his stunning victory over the Persian king Darius at the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander found himself the master of an empire that stretched from Greece to Egypt and deep into Central Asia. He could have simply been a Greek overlord ruling through fear and garrisoned troops, but Alexander envisioned something far grander, a fused world, a melting pot of Greek and Persian culture where he would be the unifying king for all. To achieve this, he embarked on a series of stunningly symbolic acts. He began wearing elements of Persian royal dress, the very clothing of the man he had defeated. He incorporated Persian nobles into his administration and even his elite companion cavalry, positions previously reserved for Macedonians. Most shocking to his Macedonian veterans, he introduced the Persian court ritual of proskyneses, the act of prostrating oneself before the king, a practice the Greeks saw as fit only for gods. While this particular move went too far and caused a famous rift with his men, his overall strategy was brilliant. In Egypt, he had himself declared the son of the god Amun-Ra, seamlessly stepping into the role of pharaoh. By adopting the trappings of local power, he wasn't just playing dress-up, he was sending a clear message to his new subjects: I am not a foreign destroyer. I am your legitimate ruler, here to uphold your traditions and honor your gods. This reputational makeover transformed him from a brutal conqueror into a divinely ordained monarch for every culture under his control, a move that secured his hold on the empire far more effectively than his army could have done alone. Centuries before Alexander, the architects of the vast Persian Achaemenid Empire had pioneered this very approach. The Persian kings, from Cyrus the Great onward, understood that their immense domain, which encompassed dozens of different peoples from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, could only be held together through a policy of intelligent tolerance. Instead of crushing local identities, they celebrated and incorporated them. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, often called the First Charter of Human Rights, boasts of Cyrus restoring deported peoples to their homelands and allowing them to rebuild their temples. This was a masterstroke of reputational engineering. To the Jewish people whom the Babylonians had exiled, Cyrus was a messiah-like liberator for permitting their return to Jerusalem. To other subject nations, he was a restorer of order and a respecter of their gods. The Persians presented themselves not as erasers of culture, but as its protectors, positioning the great king as a benevolent overseer of a harmonious, multicultural system. They allowed local governors or satraps a significant degree of autonomy, so long as taxes were paid and order was maintained. This policy built a reputation for Persian rule as being relatively light and pragmatic, which drastically reduced the urge to rebel. Why risk everything to overthrow a king who largely left you to your own devices and respected your way of life? This reputation for tolerance became a cornerstone of Persian imperial strength, creating a stability that allowed for incredible achievements in infrastructure, like the royal road that connected the empire. Yet this strategy was not without its significant risks, creating a constant tension at the heart of imperial rule. The very acts that made a ruler popular with newly conquered peoples could be seen as a betrayal by the original power base that brought him to power in the first place. Alexander's Macedonian troops, the hardened veterans who had fought for him since the beginning, were deeply unnerved by his adoption of Persian customs. They saw his wearing of Persian dress not as savvy politics, but as a rejection of his Macedonian roots and the simple, warrior ethos they valued. The introduction of proskyneses was the final straw for many, as it violated their deep-seated cultural belief that such obeisance was reserved for deities, not mortal men. Their grumbling nearly escalated into a full-scale mutiny, forcing Alexander to brilliantly talk them down, reminding them of their shared history and glory. This incident highlights the precarious balancing act of cultural assimilation. A ruler had to constantly look in two directions at once, presenting one face to his diverse empire while reassuring his core supporters that he remained one of them. Alienating this core group, the army, the aristocracy, the priestly class of the homeland, could be just as dangerous as facing a foreign revolt, as it threatened to pull the very foundation of power out from under him. The most successful rulers were those who managed this balancing act with subtlety and theatrical flair. They understood that assimilation wasn't about abandoning their own identity, but about adding new layers to it, creating a composite reputation that could appeal to multiple audiences simultaneously. A Persian king might be depicted in Egyptian-style reliefs on a monument in Egypt, making offerings to Egyptian gods, while back in Persia, he would be shown in traditional Persian style receiving the tribute of subject nations. The Roman Emperor Augustus famously had his image and titles adapted on monuments across the empire to suit local sensibilities. In the Greek East, he was often referred to with the Hellenistic title Sebastos, the Greek word for venerable, and associated with Zeus. In the Latin West, he was the traditional imperator. This wasn't hypocrisy, it was sophisticated branding. It allowed different populations to see in him what they needed to see, to interpret his rule through the lens of their own cultural expectations. The goal was to create a reputation not as a foreigner, but as a universal figure, a ruler whose authority transcended local customs because it was built upon a respectful understanding of them. In doing so, these ancient masters of reputation discovered a timeless truth. The most powerful throne is not made of gold or enforced by legions, but is built from the willing acceptance of the people, an acceptance earned by a leader smart enough to speak their language, both literally and culturally. While monuments and military victories might capture the imagination, the true measure of a ruler's effectiveness often resided in the bustling activity of the marketplace and the steady flow of goods along well-protected trade routes. A prosperous economy with full granaries, bustling ports, and a sound currency was the most powerful engine for building a reputation as a capable and benevolent leader. Citizens who felt economically secure were far more likely to be loyal, while merchants who profited from stable trade became powerful advocates for the regime that enabled their success. Conversely, empty coffers, barren markets, and insecure roads could swiftly unravel years of careful image building, transforming a revered monarch into a target of public scorn and international ridicule. In this way, commerce became a vital artery of political power, and a ruler's skill in managing it was directly reflected in their public standing. The Phoenician city-states of the ancient Mediterranean, such as Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, offer a stunning early example of how commercial acumen could forge a legendary reputation entirely separate from military conquest. Nestled on a narrow coastal strip with limited farmland, the Phoenicians turned to the sea not as conquerors, but as the ancient world's premier merchants and explorers. Their reputation was built on luxury and reliability. They were famed for their exquisite purple dye, extracted at great cost from the murex snail, which became the ultimate status symbol for royalty across the region. More importantly, they were known as master shipbuilders and navigators, establishing a vast network of trading posts and colonies that stretched from Cyprus to Sicily, North Africa, and even beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. A Phoenician trader's word was his bond, and the goods he carried were synonymous with the highest quality. This commercial reputation granted the Phoenician elite something remarkable: immense wealth and influence without the need to maintain a massive land empire. Their rulers were not celebrated as great warriors but as patrons of enterprise, their legacies measured in the prosperity of their port cities and the far-flung reach of their merchant fleets. They proved that a reputation for facilitating wealth could be just as potent as one built on conquest, creating a form of soft power that made them indispensable partners to empires like Assyria and Egypt, who valued their goods and their nautical expertise more than they desired their territory. Centuries later, a different kind of commercial network would emerge in Northern Europe, one that again demonstrated the potent link between trade and political reputation. The Hanseatic League, a confederation of merchant guilds and their market towns, flourished from the 13th to the 17th centuries. While not a kingdom with a single ruler, the League's success was a direct result of the reputations of the city councils and merchants who ran it. Their power was not vested in a crown or an army, but in a shared commitment to commercial excellence and mutual protection. The Hanseatic reputation was built on a triad of strengths: consistent quality, collective security, and business integrity. They established trading posts or kontor in cities from London to Novgorod, where their merchants enjoyed special privileges granted by local rulers desperate to access their network. These privileges were not given freely. They were earned through a reputation for delivering coveted goods like Baltic timber, furs, and amber reliably and efficiently. The League's word was its currency. If a foreign prince violated an agreement with the Hanse, the entire League could impose a trade embargo, a devastating economic weapon that could cripple a local economy and force a swift apology. The leaders of Hanseatic cities like Lübeck and Hamburg derived their political authority from their ability to guarantee this commercial stability. Their reputation for fairness in dispute resolution and their fierce protection of trade routes against pirates made them the de facto rulers of the North Sea and Baltic Sea economies, proving that even without a throne, a reputation for enabling prosperity could command immense respect and power. However, the path of commerce was fraught with reputational peril. A ruler's failure to protect vital trade routes could be seen as a profound weakness, inviting both economic decay and political challenge. The most famous example of this might be the Roman Republic's confrontation with pirates in the 1st century BC. For years, piracy had plagued the Mediterranean, strangling the sea lanes that carried the grain supply essential for feeding the population of Rome. The Senate's initial piecemeal efforts to combat this threat were woefully ineffective, leading to skyrocketing food prices, public unrest, and a growing perception that the ruling aristocracy was either incompetent or corrupt. The pirates grew so bold that they even raided the port of Ostia and kidnapped magistrates, a humiliating blow to Roman prestige. This crisis created a reputational vacuum, which the general Pompey the Great was quick to fill. The Senate, desperate for a solution, passed the Lex Gabinia, granting Pompey unprecedented powers and a vast fleet to eradicate the pirate threat. He accomplished this mission with stunning speed and efficiency. By clearing the seas, Pompey didn't just solve a logistical problem. He performed an act of spectacular reputational repair for the Roman state and built his own legend as the Republic's indispensable protector. His success highlighted a fundamental truth. A ruler's ability to guarantee safe passage for merchants and goods was a non-negotiable component of their claim to legitimate power. Failure to do so was an open invitation for a rival to step in and claim the mantle of the true guardian of prosperity. Furthermore, a reputation for fair dealing in commerce could open diplomatic doors that remained closed to mere military might. Rulers known for honoring contracts, protecting foreign merchants, and maintaining stable currencies became magnets for international business. The wealth that followed these merchants then filled the royal coffers through taxes and tariffs, funding further projects that enhanced the ruler's prestige. This created a virtuous cycle. Commercial success built a reputation for good governance, which attracted more trade, which in turn created more wealth and reinforced the ruler's power. Conversely, a king who arbitrarily seized merchant assets, debased the coinage, or engaged in erratic taxation quickly gained a reputation for treachery that could isolate his kingdom. Word traveled fast along trade routes, and a single act of bad faith could deter merchants for a generation, leading to economic stagnation and a slow but sure erosion of the rulers standing both at home and abroad. In the intricate and interconnected ancient world, a handshake with a merchant could be as significant as a treaty with a king, and the reputation forged in the marketplace often proved to be the most durable currency of all. But beyond the flow of commerce and the spectacles of the arena, there existed a far more profound and personal way for a ruler to win the hearts of their people, by becoming the guardian of their rights and the arbiter of their disputes. In a world where the powerful could easily prey on the weak, a reputation for justice was a currency of immeasurable value. A leader who could present themselves as a source of fair and predictable law wasn't just a conqueror or a patron. They were a pillar of societal order, a figure who earned loyalty not through fear or bribery, but through a deeply felt sense of legitimacy. This was the power of legal reform, a tool that allowed shrewd rulers to address simmering social tensions, consolidate their own power, and craft an enduring legacy as wise and virtuous stewards of their realm. The most iconic example of this strategy is literally set in stone. Around 1750 BC, the Babylonian king Hammurabi raised a towering black diorite stele, and upon it he inscribed a detailed legal code comprising 282 laws. This was not a hidden document for priests and scribes. It was erected in a public place for all to see, a revolutionary act in itself. The Code of Hammurabi covered everything from property rights and trade regulations to family law and assault, famously operating on the principle of an eye for an eye. But its true genius was not in its specific punishments. It was in its mere existence as a public, written standard. For the first time on such a scale, law was not merely the arbitrary whim of a local official or a distant king. It was a known quantity. A common farmer could, in theory, know what his rights were and what to expect if they were violated. The prologue and epilogue of the code are masterpieces of reputation management, where Hammurabi explicitly states that the gods themselves appointed him to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, that the strong might not oppress the weak. He presents himself not as an author of laws, but as a divinely chosen channel for them, weaving his own authority into the very fabric of cosmic order. This public commitment to codified justice, however imperfectly applied in practice, created a powerful narrative of Hammurabi as a just king, a reputation that secured his dynasty's hold on power and ensured his name would be remembered for millennia as a foundational lawgiver. A similar story of using legal reform to solve a crisis and build legitimacy unfolded centuries later in ancient Athens. By the early 6th century BC, the city-state was teetering on the brink of civil war. The root cause was debt. Poor farmers, unable to pay their creditors, were being sold into slavery, and the vast gulf between the wealthy aristocracy and the desperate poor threatened to tear the polis apart. Into this volatile situation stepped Solon, appointed as archon with special powers to mediate. His solution was a sweeping package of reforms known as the seisachtheia, or the shaking off of burdens. He cancelled all outstanding debts and freed those who had been enslaved because of them. He did not, however, redistribute land, a move that would have pleased the poor but enraged the rich. This careful balancing act was the key to his success. Solon understood that justice was not about giving one side everything it wanted. It was about creating a system that was perceived as fair enough by all parties to prevent societal collapse. He went further, reforming the political system to allow wealth, rather than just noble birth, to determine eligibility for office, opening a path to power for a broader segment of the population. By addressing the most urgent economic grievances and creating a more inclusive legal and political framework, Solon didn't just avert a disaster. He built a reputation as a supremely wise and impartial lawgiver. His reforms became the bedrock of Athenian democracy, and his reputation for fairness was so profound that later generations would count him among the 7 sages of Greece. He proved that the most effective way to disarm social conflict was not with soldiers, but with a just legal code. However, this hard-won reputational capital was incredibly fragile, and nothing could drain it faster than the perception of corruption or arbitrary rule. The later Roman Empire provides a stark cautionary tale. In its early centuries, Roman law was a source of immense pride and stability, a complex and evolving system that applied to citizen and emperor alike. The concept of ius civile, the law of the citizens, was a cornerstone of Roman identity. But as the empire grew more autocratic, especially from the 3rd century AD onward, the law became a tool of the emperor's unchecked will. The famous principle quod principi placuit legis habet vigorum, what pleases the prince has the force of law, signaled a dramatic shift. Law was no longer something that emanated from the Senate and the people. It was whatever the emperor decreed. This arbitrariness created a climate of fear and uncertainty. A wealthy senator could have his property confiscated and his life ended on a mere suspicion without any semblance of a fair trial. Justice became a commodity available to the highest bidder or the most well-connected insider. The legal system, once a pillar of imperial reputation, now became a symbol of its corruption. This erosion of legal trust mirrored the empire's overall decline. When citizens and elites alike believe that the rules no longer apply fairly, that there is no recourse against power, their loyalty to the system evaporates. They become more concerned with currying favor with the powerful than with upholding the common good, leading to a hollowed-out and brittle state. The later Roman Empire's reputation for injustice and caprice undermined its stability from within, making it vulnerable to external threats and internal fragmentation, proving that a throne built on law could be far more resilient than one reliant solely on force. But behind the grand spectacles of justice and the public decrees, in the shadowy corners of the palace and the crowded alleys of the forum, another, far more clandestine game of reputation was always being played. For every law publicly inscribed, there were a dozen secrets whispered in the dark, gathered by the silent, unseen actors who truly knew the pulse of an empire, the spies. While rulers built their public image on stone and coin, their most valuable intelligence often came from the hidden networks of informants who told them what was being said when no one thought the throne was listening. This invisible web of eyes and ears was the ultimate tool for preemptive reputation management, allowing a leader to sniff out dissent before it could spread, to plant damaging rumors about rivals, and to protect their carefully constructed facade from any threat, no matter how small or distant. The Persians, masters of administering a vast and diverse empire, understood this need for centralized intelligence better than most. They established a formal institution known as the king's eyes and the king's ears. These were not metaphorical titles. They were official royal agents invested with the authority of the monarch himself. The king's eyes were inspectors who would travel unexpectedly to the various satrapies or provinces, auditing the accounts and observing the behavior of the local governors. They ensured that taxes were being collected properly, and more importantly, that no satrap was becoming too powerful or popular, potentially threatening the king's authority. The king's ears were even more intriguing. They were the clandestine listeners, the officials who blended into the local population to gauge sentiment and report on gossip. The sheer existence of this system was a powerful psychological tool. A satrap governing a province 1,000 miles from the capital could never be certain if the merchant he was negotiating with or the servant pouring his wine was one of the king's ears. This pervasive suspicion fostered a climate of caution and loyalty, as the reputation of the king's omniscience kept potential rivals in a constant state of paranoid obedience. It was a system designed to make the king's presence felt in every corner of his realm, even when he was physically absent, ensuring that his reputation for ultimate control was never questioned. The Romans, ever practical, integrated espionage directly into the machinery of their military and state. Their key intelligence agents were the frumentarii. Originally, as their name suggests, these were soldiers tasked with the crucial but mundane job of procuring grain frumentum for the legions stationed across the empire. This duty gave them a perfect cover. They traveled constantly along the empire's vast network of roads, moving between military camps, provincial towns, and the capital. They knew the terrain, the local officials, and the supply lines intimately. Emperors, beginning with Domitian in the 1st century AD, recognized their potential and transformed them into a formal imperial courier and intelligence service. The frumentarii became the eyes and ears of the emperor, carrying sensitive messages, but also gathering information on everything from troop morale and gubernatorial corruption to subversive religious cults and popular gossip. They were the perfect agents because their presence was so ordinary, so unremarkable. Who would suspect the man arranging for wheat shipments of being a spy? Based in a dedicated headquarters in Rome called the Castra Peregrina, or the Fort of the Foreigners, the Frumentarii became a powerful and deeply feared instrument of control. Their reputation for secrecy and reach meant that a careless word muttered in a tavern in Britannia could eventually find its way to the emperor's court in Rome, a chilling deterrent against disloyalty that protected the imperial image by ruthlessly eliminating any nascent threat. Perhaps no story better illustrates the devastating personal cost of this hidden war of whispers than the downfall of the Athenian general Alcibiades during the Peloponnesian War. Charismatic, brilliant, and notoriously ambitious, Alcibiades was a polarizing figure whose reputation was his greatest asset and his most glaring vulnerability. On the eve of leading a massive Athenian expedition to Sicily, a bizarre scandal erupted. In a single night, countless statues of Hermes, the messenger god and protector of travelers, were mysteriously mutilated throughout Athens. This was seen as a terrible omen for the upcoming campaign and a direct act of impiety. Alcibiades' many political enemies seized on the moment. They didn't attack his military strategy directly. Instead, they used whispers and insinuation, accusing him of being behind the sacrilege, claiming it was the act of a drunken, arrogant aristocrat with no respect for the gods. Their real weapon was not the accusation itself, but the cloud of suspicion it created. Even though the evidence was flimsy, the damage to his reputation was immediate and severe. The Athenian assembly, swayed by the toxic rumors, initially allowed him to lead the fleet but soon recalled him to stand trial. Knowing his enemies had already poisoned the public against him, Alcibiades made a fateful decision. He defected to Sparta, Athens' mortal enemy. This act of treason, born from espionage and character assassination, confirmed every dark suspicion about him in the minds of the Athenians and utterly destroyed his standing. His story is a classic case of how intelligence operations could target not just military plans, but the very character of a leader, using rumor and scandal to manipulate public perception and achieve what armies could not. The tools of these ancient spy networks were as varied as their missions. Beyond simply listening, they were masters of active deception. They would spread disinformation to confuse enemy states, perhaps leaking false plans about an invasion route to force an adversary to deploy troops to the wrong location. They used clandestine communication methods like invisible ink, made from milk or fruit juices, and cipher systems to encode their messages, but their primary target was often the intangible realm of public opinion. A spy might be tasked with gauging the mood of the populace after a new tax was announced or monitoring the dinner parties of the elite for any trace of seditious talk. This intelligence allowed a ruler to be proactive. A hint of unrest in a province could be quelled with a preemptive shipment of grain or the sudden, well-timed removal of an unpopular official. A rival gaining too much popularity could be undermined by a carefully placed rumor about his personal life or his ambition. This was reputation management in its most raw and ruthless form. It was about controlling the narrative not through public monuments, but through private whispers, ensuring that the version of reality most beneficial to the ruler was the one that eventually trickled down into the public consciousness, all while the true architects of that narrative remained forever in the shadows, the anonymous guardians of a throne built as much on secrets as it was on stone. Imagine the ground itself turning against you, the skies withholding rain, or an invisible sickness stealing the breath from your loved ones. For an ancient ruler, a natural disaster was far more than a humanitarian crisis. It was the ultimate test of their entire legitimacy. In a world where the leader was often seen as the crucial link between the people and the gods, a famine, earthquake, or plague wasn't just bad luck. It was a potential sign of divine displeasure, a direct reflection on the person sitting on the throne. How a leader responded in these moments of sheer terror and chaos could cement their reputation as a compassionate father to their people, or expose them as a failed intermediary whose weakness had brought the wrath of the heavens down upon everyone. The rhythm of life in ancient Egypt was dictated by the Nile. Its annual flood was the pulse of the civilization, depositing the rich black silt that made the desert bloom. But the Nile was unpredictable. A flood that was too low meant famine and starvation. A flood that was too high meant catastrophic destruction. The pharaoh's most sacred duty, therefore, was to serve as the guarantor of the perfect flood. He was not just a political leader, he was a religious figurehead responsible for maintaining mad cosmic order. When the flood failed, it wasn't just an agricultural problem. It was a theological crisis that struck at the very heart of the pharaoh's reputation. In response, the pharaoh didn't just open granaries, though that was crucial. He performed elaborate rituals and sacrifices to appease Hapi, the god of the Nile, and to demonstrate to his people that he was actively restoring the balance between the human and divine world. His ability to manage the crisis both practically and spiritually was a live-fire exercise in reputation management. Success meant being seen as a true living god in tune with the universe. Failure risked being seen as the cause of the imbalance, opening the door to rebellion, assassination, or a dark legacy as a ruler who had lost the favor of the gods. Centuries later, a very different kind of disaster tested the mettle of a Roman emperor known for his philosophy. In 1660 AD, during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, a devastating pandemic now known as the Antonine Plague swept through the Roman Empire. Believed to have been smallpox or measles brought back by legions from the Near East, the plague killed millions, decimating the population and even crippling the Roman army at a time when it was already engaged in difficult wars on the northern frontiers. For Marcus Aurelius, the Stoic philosopher king, this was a brutal test of his own principles. He could have retreated to the safety of a secluded villa, as some later emperors did during plagues. Instead, he did the opposite. He emptied the imperial treasury to fund public funerals and care for the sick. He personally oversaw the crisis response, even as the disease raged through the capital. Most importantly, he stayed in Rome, sharing in the danger and the grief of his people. His actions were a powerful public performance of the Stoic virtue of duty. By refusing to flee, by spending his own wealth, and by confronting the suffering head-on, he reinforced his hard-earned reputation as the wise, compassionate, and responsible pater patriae, the father of the country. The plague was a catastrophe, but Marcus Aurelius's response became a defining part of his legacy, transforming him from a remote philosopher into a relatable leader who did not abandon his people in their darkest hour. This starkly contrasts with the response of the Byzantine Emperor Justinian during the plague that bears his name in the 6th century. The initial outbreak in 541 AD was even more devastating than the Antonine Plague, and it struck at the very height of Justinian's ambitions to reconquer the Western Roman Empire. Procopius, the era's historian, recorded the terror and the staggering death toll. Justinian himself actually contracted the plague and nearly died. His administration did attempt practical measures, such as disposing of the countless dead to prevent further spread. However, the scale of the disaster was so immense that it overwhelmed the state's capacity to respond effectively. The economic devastation was permanent, the army was shattered and the public's morale was broken. Justinian's grand dreams of restoration died with a significant portion of his tax base and manpower. While not necessarily seen as negligent, the plague irrevocably damaged his reputation and his legacy. It became an indelible mark on his reign, a demonstration of how even the most powerful ruler could be brought low by forces utterly beyond their control, and how a disaster could permanently shift the public perception of an era from one of glorious ambition to one of tragic despair. The calculus of disaster response often involved a painful and cynical decision for rulers: compassion versus control. Providing aid, distributing food, and rebuilding cities were expensive endeavors that could drain a treasury and weaken the state militarily. Yet, failing to do so risked massive civil unrest, rebellion, or even the overthrow of the dynasty. The most astute leaders understood that a disaster was not just a threat, but also an opportunity. A generous response could be a powerful investment in public loyalty, a moment to prove the state's value and the ruler's personal virtue. It was a chance to demonstrate that the social contract was real, that in return for their taxes and their obedience, the people could expect protection and support when the world fell apart. This is why we see emperors like Augustus establishing a permanent grain dole for the city of Rome, or Trajan expanding the alimentus system to support poor children across Italy. These were not merely welfare programs, they were sophisticated reputational safety nets designed to ensure that when famine or earthquake struck, the populace would look to the emperor for salvation, not to a revolutionary demagogue promising to tear the system down. Conversely, a ruler perceived as absent, greedy, or indifferent during a catastrophe could see their legitimacy evaporate overnight. If the emperor was feasting in his palace while the people starved, or if he was seen to be hoarding grain for the army instead of feeding civilians, the public's fear could quickly curdle into rage. In such an environment, rumors spread like wildfire. The disaster would inevitably be interpreted as a punishment from the gods for the ruler's personal failings, his impiety, his arrogance, or his cruelty. This created a dangerous feedback loop. The disaster damaged the ruler's reputation, and the damaged reputation then became the explanation for the disaster. This could justify revolt in the minds of the people, making the leader not just incompetent, but morally responsible for their suffering. The management of a natural disaster was therefore a high-stakes performance of leadership, a desperate attempt to control the narrative of why the disaster happened, and more importantly, who was going to save them from it. In the end, the survival of an ancient ruler often depended less on preventing the earthquake or stopping the plague, an impossible task, and more on mastering the human earthquake of public perception that followed in its wake. But the most dramatic and chilling form of posthumous reputation management was not celebration or vilification, but complete and total erasure. The Romans had a formal practice for this, known as damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. This was not a casual slur. It was an official Senate decree that declared a deceased emperor a public enemy, effectively attempting to surgically remove them from history itself. The process was terrifyingly thorough. The condemned individual's name would be chiseled off every public inscription, their portraits defaced or recarved to represent a more acceptable successor, and their laws repealed. Coins bearing their image were often melted down. It was a targeted assassination of a person's legacy, a desperate attempt to undo their existence in the public record and in the collective consciousness of the state. The hope was that by destroying all physical reminders, the memory of the tyrant would simply fade away, leaving no toxic model for future aspirants to power. We see this with emperors like Domitian or Commodus, whose once omnipresent images in marble and bronze were systematically hacked away, leaving only ghostly outlines and empty spaces where a face used to be. Yet, the very effort often betrayed its own futility. The conspicuous absence itself became a monument, a negative space that screamed of the person who had been there, ensuring that the act of erasure sometimes preserved the memory of the condemned more effectively than a simple, quiet forgetting ever could. Perhaps the most fascinating posthumous reputational journey is that of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. In the 14th century BC, he launched a radical religious revolution, abandoning the traditional pantheon of Egyptian gods to worship a single deity, the Aten or sun disk. He moved the capital to a new city, Akhenaten, and his art style broke from thousands of years of tradition, depicting the royal family in a startlingly elongated and naturalistic form. To the powerful priesthood of Ammon he displaced, and to many of his subjects, these actions were not progressive, they were heretical and catastrophic. Upon his death, his monuments were torn down, his city abandoned, and his name omitted from official king lists. His immediate successors, including the famous Tutankhamun, worked tirelessly to restore the old gods and erase all traces of his disruptive reign. For centuries, Akhenaten was quite literally a lost pharaoh, his existence almost completely wiped from history. Yet, reputations can be strangely resilient. Thousands of years later, in the 19th century, archaeologists began to piece together the evidence of his rule. To the modern eye, Akhenaten was transformed. Where ancient Egyptians saw a heretic, modern scholars saw a revolutionary monotheist, a visionary artist, and a bold individual who challenged an entrenched orthodoxy. His reputation was completely rehabilitated, not by political allies, but by the shifting values of a new era. He was no longer a cautionary tale of impiety, but was recast as a fascinating, enigmatic figure ahead of his time. His story powerfully illustrates that a legacy is never truly fixed. It is a conversation between the past and the present, constantly being re-evaluated through the lens of contemporary beliefs, ensuring that the ancient game of reputation continues to be played long after the final breath is drawn. And so the echoes of this ancient game reverberate through the centuries, proving that while the stages and technologies have transformed, the fundamental rules of reputation remain stubbornly, powerfully unchanged. The digital agora of the 24-hour news cycle and the global town square of social media have not replaced the forums of Rome or the royal courts of Persia. They have simply amplified them, giving every whisper the potential to become a roar and every public figure a pantheon of gods and critics to answer to. Today's leaders, from politicians to CEOs, are playing a version of the same high-stakes game that toppled pharaohs and made emperors, and the lessons etched in stone and on coin are more relevant than ever. The core truth endures: reputation is not merely a reflection of reality, but a force that actively shapes it, a currency that can be earned, spent, devalued, and weaponized in the blink of an eye. Consider the modern art of political branding, a direct descendant of the imagery stamped on ancient denarii. A candidate's campaign is a masterclass in curated perception, not unlike Augustus crafting his res gesti. Every photo opportunity, every slogan, every carefully chosen backdrop is a calculated move to project a specific narrative of strength, of empathy, of authenticity, of change. The humble coin has been replaced by the campaign poster, the television ad, and the social media profile, but the objective is identical: to control the image that reaches the public and to make a complex individual instantly recognizable through a set of simplified, powerful symbols. A modern leader's team, much like the poets and artists patronized by ancient rulers, works tirelessly to align their principles' actions with this overarching narrative, to ensure that a policy announcement reinforces the brand of a champion of the people, or a foreign trip underscores an image of a respected statesman on the world stage. The failure to maintain this consistency, to have the brand contradicted by reality, is the modern equivalent of a Roman emperor debasing his currency. It creates a crippling trust deficit where promises feel hollow and the face on the screen seems divorced from the actions it represents. This battle to control the narrative leads us directly to the ancient tool of propaganda, now supercharged by the algorithms and networks of our digital age. The Roman emperors had their scribes and their stonemasons to spread their version of events. Today's actors have bots, troll farms, and targeted advertising. The principle of shaping reality through selective storytelling is ancient, but the scale and speed are unprecedented. Disinformation campaigns are the dark echo of the whispered rumors used to destroy Alcibiades, now capable of reaching millions in minutes instead of fermenting in the Athenian agora for weeks. The challenge for the modern citizen is the same as it was for the subject of an ancient kingdom: to discern the truth amidst a cacophony of competing narratives, each claiming authenticity. We are all, in a sense, living in the court of a digital emperor, constantly presented with curated realities, and our critical thinking is the most vital defense against the modern equivalent of damnatio memoriae, the attempt to erase factual truth and replace it with a more convenient fiction. Yet perhaps the most profound parallel lies in the eternal test of crisis management. Just as Marcus Aurelius faced the Antonine Plague, today's leaders are judged not in times of calm, but in moments of turmoil, a natural disaster, an economic crash, a pandemic. The public's gaze becomes intensely focused, scrutinizing every word and deed for signs of competence, empathy, and trustworthiness. The leader who is perceived as absent, selfish, or incompetent suffers a reputational collapse as swift and final as any ancient ruler blamed for a failed Nile flood. Conversely, those who demonstrate transparency, take responsibility, and put the collective good first can build a reservoir of goodwill that sustains them for years. The ancient lesson is clear: a crisis is not just a threat to be managed, but a reputation to be won. It is the ultimate demonstration of a leader's character, revealing the substance behind the carefully constructed brand, and proving that while spectacles can win temporary favor, it is genuine, decisive action in the hardest of times that forges a legacy of true respect and enduring power. Throughout history, reputation has been the invisible architecture of power, shaping who rose to rule and who fell into obscurity. From the divine associations of pharaohs to the calculated propaganda of Roman emperors, the ancient game of reputation was never a simple matter of personal character. It was a complex and often brutal blend of myth, tangible achievement, and carefully managed perception, a high-stakes contest where the story told about a leader could prove more decisive than the army they commanded. We have journeyed through the strategies they employed, from the thunderous applause of the Colosseum to the silent, enduring messages stamped on coins, from the grand decrees carved into stone cliffs to the shadowy whispers of spies in the forum. Each tool, whether a glorious spectacle or a hidden network of informants, served the same ultimate purpose: to craft and control a narrative that would command loyalty, deter challengers, and cement a legacy. These strategies from antiquity remind us with startling clarity that reputation is far more than a personal attribute. It is a strategic asset, a form of currency that must be earned, invested, and protected with relentless vigilance. It requires the foresight to build monuments that will outlive you, the generosity to win public affection during times of peace, and the unwavering strength to project invincibility during times of crisis. The most successful rulers understood that their image was a garden that needed constant tending. A single season of neglect could allow the weeds of scandal, defeat, or dissent to choke out years of careful cultivation. They knew that perception, once solidified into reputation, becomes a reality of its own, one that can open doors to unimaginable power or slam them shut forever. As we reflect on these ancient lessons, their echoes feel unmistakably familiar in our modern world. The digital arena of social media has become our global forum, where public perception is shaped and shattered at lightning speed. The carefully curated image of a political leader, the brand narrative of a corporation, even the personal online presence we all manage, these are all extensions of the same eternal game. The tools have evolved from stone and silver to pixels and algorithms, but the fundamental principles remain unchanged. We still see the strategic building of myth, the weaponization of rumor, the importance of public performance, and the devastating speed with which a hard-earned reputation can collapse. Understanding this deep historical context allows us to be more discerning players and observers in our own time, to look beyond the curated image and recognize the age-old strategies at work behind the scenes. The game continues all around us. What do you see? Share your thoughts on where you spot the ancient game of reputation playing out today in the comments